Chapter 8, Part 2 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bicêtre, Part 2. Dr. Herbin, the individual alluded to, was a man of about the middle age, with a countenance expressive of great kindness and benevolence, united to extreme skill and penetration in discovering the extent of malady with which his unfortunate patients were affected. His voice, naturally harmonious, assumed a tone of gentle suavity when he spoke to the poor lunatics, who, however bereft of reason, seemed always to listen with peculiar delight to his soft, soothing words, which frequently had the effect of subduing the invariable irritability attendant on this fearful complaint. Monsieur Herbin had been among the first to substitute, in his treatment of madness, sympathy and commiseration for the frightful remedies ordinarily employed. He abandoned the coercive system, so repugnant to every principle of humanity, for kind words, conciliating looks, and a ready attention to every request that could reasonably be granted. He banished chains, whips, drenching with cold water, and even solitary confinement, except in cases of urgent necessity. "Monsieur," said Madame Georges, addressing the doctor, "I have ventured hither with my son and daughter, although personally unknown to Monsieur Morel. But my interest in his unfortunate state made me desirous of witnessing the experiment you are about to make to restore his reason. You have every hope of succeeding, have you not?" "I certainly reckon much, madame, on the good effects likely to be produced by the sight of his daughter and the persons he has been in the constant habit of seeing." "When my husband was arrested," said Morel's wife, pointing to Rigolette, "our kind young friend here was nursing me and my children." "And my father knew Monsieur Germain quite well," said Louise. Then, directing the attention of Monsieur Herbin to Alfred and Anastasie, she added, "Monsieur and Madame here were porters at the house, and assisted our family to the utmost of their ability." "I am greatly obliged to you, my worthy friend," said the doctor, addressing Alfred, "for quitting your occupation to come hither; but I see by your amiable countenance that you have cheerfully sacrificed your time to visit your poor lodger here." "Sir," replied Pipelet, gravely bowing, "men should help each other in this sublunary world, and remember that all are brothers; added to which your unfortunate patient was the very cream and essence of an honest man, and therefore do I respect him." "If you are not afraid, madame," said Dr. Herbin to Madame Georges, "of the sight of the poor creatures here, we will cross some of the yards leading to that part of the building where I have deemed it advisable to remove Morel, instead of allowing him to accompany the others to the farm as usual." "The farm!" exclaimed Madame Georges. "Have you a farm here?" "Your surprise is perfectly natural, madame. Yes, we have a farm, the produce of which is most serviceable to the establishment, although entirely worked by the patients." "Is it possible? Can you make these lunatics work, and allow them to be at liberty while they do so?" "Certainly. Exercise, the calm tranquillity of the fields, with the aspect of nature, are among our most certain means of cure. Only one keeper goes with them, and we have rarely had an instance of any patient endeavouring to get away. They are delighted to be employed, and the trifling reward they gain serves still to improve their condition, by enabling them to purchase different little indulgences. But we have reached the gate conducting to one of these courts." Then, perceiving a slight appearance of alarm on the countenance of Madame Georges, the doctor added, "Lay aside all apprehension, madame. In a very few minutes you will feel as tranquil as I do myself." "I follow you, sir. Come, my children." "Anastasie," whispered Pipelet, "when I think that, had the persecutions of that odious Cabrion continued, your poor dear Alfred might have become mad, like the unhappy wretches we are about to behold, clad in the most wild and singular state, chained up by the middle, or confined in dens like the wild beasts in the Jardin des Plantes." "Oh, bless your dear old heart! Don't talk of such a thing. La! I've heard say that them as has gone mad for love are for all the world like born devils directly they see a woman, dashing against the bars of their dens, and making all sorts of horrid noises, till the keepers are forced to flog them till they drop, or else turn great taps of water on their heads before they can quiet them." "Anastasie," rejoined Pipelet, gravely, "I desire you will not go too close to these dreadful creatures. An accident so soon happens." "Besides," answered Anastasie, with a tone of sentimental melancholy, "poor things! I have no business to show myself just for the sake of tantalizing them. 'Tis woman's beauty and fascination reduces them to this horrid state. I declare I feel a cold shudder creep over me as I reflect that, perhaps, if I had refused to make you a happy man, Alfred, you might at this very minute be raving mad for love, and shut up in one of those dens, roaring out the moment you caught sight of a woman; while, as it is, my poor old duck is glad to get out of the way of the naughty females that will be trying to make him notice them." "'Tis true, my modesty is easily alarmed. But, Anastasie, the door opens. I tremble with dread of what we are about to witness. No doubt the most hideous-looking people, and all sorts of dreadful noises, rattling of chains and grinding of teeth." The door being opened admitted them into a long courtyard, planted with rows of trees, under which benches were placed. On each side was a well-constructed and spacious portico, or covered stone terrace, with which a range of large airy cells communicated. A number of men, all alike clad in a grey dress, were walking, talking, or conversing in this pleasant retreat, while others were seated on the benches, enjoying the refreshing shade and fresh open air. At the sight of Doctor Herbin, a number of the unfortunate lunatics pressed around him, with every manifestation of joy and delight, extending to him their hands with an expression of grateful confidence, to which he cordially responded by saying, "Good day, my worthy fellows! I am glad to see you all so well and happy." Some of the poor lunatics, too far from the doctor to be able to seize his hand, ventured, with a sort of timid hesitation, to offer theirs to the persons who were with him. "Good morning, friends," said Germain, shaking hands in a manner so cordial as to fill the unfortunate beings with happiness. "Are these the mad patients?" inquired Madame Georges. "Nearly the worst belonging to the establishment," answered the doctor, smiling. "They are permitted to be together during the day, but at night they are locked up in the cells you see there." "Can it be possible that these men are really mad? But when are they violent?" "Generally at the first outbreak of their malady, when they are brought here. After a short time the soothing treatment they experience, with the society of their companions, calms and amuses them, so that their paroxysms become milder and less frequent, until at length, by the blessing of God, they recover their senses." "What are those individuals talking so earnestly about?" inquired Madame Georges. "One of them seems referring to a blind man, who, in addition to the loss of sight, seems likewise deprived of speech and reason. Have you such a one among your patients, or is the existence of this person but a mere coinage of the brain?" "Unhappily, madame, it is a fact but too true, and the history connected with it is a most singular one. The blind man concerning whom you inquire was found in a low haunt in the Champs Elysées, in which a gang of robbers and murderers of the worst description were apprehended. This wretched object was discovered chained in the midst of an underground cave, and beside him lay the stretched dead body of a woman, so horribly mutilated that it was wholly impossible to attempt to identify it. The man himself was hideously ugly, his features being quite destroyed by the application of vitriol. He has never uttered a single word since he came hither. Whether his dumbness be real or affected I know not, for, strange to say, his paroxysms always occur during the night and when I am absent, so as to baffle all conjecture as to his real situation. But his madness seems occasioned by violent rage, the cause of which we cannot find out, for, as I before observed, he never speaks or utters an articulate sound. But here he is." The whole of the party accompanying the doctor started with horror at the sight of the Schoolmaster, for he it was who merely feigned being dumb and mad to procure his own safety. The dead body found beside him was that of the Chouette, whom he had murdered, not during a paroxysm of madness, but while under the influence of such a burning fever of the brain as had produced the fearful dream he had dreamed the night he passed at the farm of Bouqueval. After his apprehension in the vaults of the tavern in the Champs Elysées, the Schoolmaster had awakened from his delirium to find himself a prisoner in one of the cells of the Conciergerie, where mad persons are temporarily placed under restraint. Hearing all about him speak of him as a raving and dangerous lunatic, he resolved to continue to enact the part, and even feigned absolute dumbness for the purpose of avoiding the chance of any questions being attempted to be put to him. His scheme succeeded. When removed to Bicêtre, he affected occasional fits of furious madness, taking care always to select the night for these outrageous bursts, the better to escape the vigilant eye of the head surgeon, the house doctor, hastily summoned, never arriving in time to witness either the beginning or ending of these attacks. The few of his accomplices who knew either his name or the fact of his having escaped from the galleys at Rochefort were ignorant of what had become of him; and even if they did, what interest could they have in denouncing him? Neither would it have been possible to establish his identity, burnt and mutilated as he was, with the daring felon of Rochefort. He hoped, therefore, by continuing to act the part of a madman, to be permitted to abide permanently at Bicêtre. Such was now the only desire of the wretch, unable longer to indulge his appetite for sinful and violent deeds. During the solitude in which he lived in Bras Rouge's cellar, remorse gradually insinuated itself into his strong heart, and, cut off from all communication with the outer world, his thoughts fled inwards, and presented him with ghastly images of those he had destroyed, till his brain burned with its own excited torture. And thus this miserable creature, still in the full vigour and strength of manhood, before whom were doubtless long years of life, and enjoying the undisturbed possession of his reason, was condemned to linger out the remainder of his days as a self-imposed mute, and in the company of fools and madmen. Or, if his imposition was discovered, his murderous deeds would conduct him to a scaffold, or condemn him to perpetual banishment among a set of villains for whom his newly awakened penitence made him feel the utmost horror. The Schoolmaster was sitting on a bench; a mass of grizzled, tangled locks hung around his huge and hideous head. Leaning his elbow on his knee, he supported his cheek in his hand. Spite of his sightless eyes and mutilated features, the revolting countenance still expressed the most bitter and overwhelming despair. "Dear mother," observed Germain, "what a wretched-looking object is this unfortunate blind man!" "Oh, yes, my son," answered Madame Georges, "it makes one's heart ache to behold a fellow creature so heavily afflicted. I know not when anything has so completely shocked me as the sight of this deplorable being." Scarcely had Madame Georges given utterance to these words than the Schoolmaster started, and his countenance, even despite its cicatrised and disfigured state, became of an ashy paleness. He rose and turned his head in the direction of Madame Georges so suddenly that she could not refrain from faintly screaming, though wholly unsuspicious of who the frightful creature really was. But the Schoolmaster's ear had readily detected the voice of his wife, and her words told him she was addressing her son. "Mother," inquired Germain, "what ails you? Are you ill?" "Nothing, my son; but the sudden movement made by that man terrified me. Indeed, sir," continued she, addressing the doctor, "I begin to feel sorry I allowed my curiosity to bring me hither." "Nay, dear mother, just for once to see such a place cannot hurt you." "I tell you what, Germain," interposed Rigolette, "I don't feel very comfortable myself, and I promise you neither your mother nor I will desire to come here again. It is too affecting." "Nonsense! You are a little coward, is she not, M. le Docteur?" "Why, really," answered M. Herbin, "I must confess that the sight of this blind lunatic affects even me, who am accustomed to such things." "What a scarecrow, old ducky, isn't he?" whispered Anastasie. "But la! To my eyes every man looks as hideous as this dreadful blind creature, in comparison with you, and that is why no one can ever boast of my having granted him the least liberty. Don't you see, Alfred?" "I tell you what, Anastasie," replied Pipelet, "I shall dream of this frightful figure. I know he will give me an attack of nightmare. I won't eat tripe for supper till I have quite forgot him." "And how do you find yourself now, friend?" asked the doctor of the Schoolmaster. But he asked in vain, no attempt was made to reply. "Come, come, continued the doctor, tapping him lightly on the shoulder. "I am sure you hear what I say. Try to make me a sign at least, or speak. Something tells me you can, if you will." But the only answer made to this address was by the Schoolmaster suddenly drooping his head, while from the sightless eyes rolled a tear. "He weeps!" exclaimed the doctor. "Poor creature!" murmured Germain, in a compassionate tone. The Schoolmaster shuddered. Again he heard the voice of his son, breathing forth commiseration for his wretched, though unknown, parent. "What is the matter?" inquired the doctor. "What is it that grieves you?" But without taking any notice of him, the Schoolmaster hid his face with his hands. "We shall make nothing of him," said the doctor. Then, perceiving how painfully this scene appeared to affect Madame Georges, he added, "Now then, madame, we will go to Morel, and if my expectations are fulfilled, you will be amply rewarded for the pain you have felt hitherto, in witnessing the joy of so good a husband and father in being restored to his family." With these words the doctor, followed by the party that had accompanied him, proceeded on his way, leaving the Schoolmaster a prey to his own distracting thoughts, the most bitter of which was the certainty of having heard his son's voice, and that of his wife, for the last time. Aware of the just horror with which he inspired them, the misery, shame, and affright with which they would have heard the disclosure of his name made him prefer 1,000 deaths to such a revelation. One only, but great consolation remained in the certainty of having awakened the pity of his son; and, with this thought to comfort him, the miserable being determined to endure his sufferings with repentance and submission. "We are now about to pass by the yard appropriated to the use of the idiot patients," said the doctor, stopping before a large grated door, through which the poor idiotic beings might be seen huddled together, with every appearance of the most distressing imbecility. Spite of Madame Georges's recent agitation, she could not refrain from casting a glance through the railing. "Poor creatures!" said she, in a gentle, pitying voice. "How dreadful to think their sufferings are hopeless! For I presume there is no remedy for such an affliction as theirs." "Alas, none, madame," replied the doctor. "But I must not allow you to dwell too long on this mournful picture of human misery. We have now arrived at the place where I expect to find Morel, whom I desired should be left entirely alone, in order to produce a more startling effect in the little project on which I build my hopes for his restoration to reason." "What idea principally occupies his mind?" asked Madame Georges. "He believes that if he cannot earn 1,300 francs by his day's work, in order to pay off a debt contracted with one Ferrand, a notary, his daughter will perish on a scaffold." "That man Ferrand was, indeed, a monster!" exclaimed Madame Georges. "Poor Louise Morel and her father were not the only victims to his villainy. He has persecuted my son with the bitterest animosity." "I have heard the whole story from Louise," replied the doctor. "Happily the wretch can no more wring your hearts with agony. But be so good as to await me here while I go to ascertain the state of Morel." Then, addressing Louise, he added, "You must carefully watch for my calling out 'Come!' Appear instantly, but let it be alone. When I call out 'Come!' for the second time, the rest of the party may make their appearance." "Alas, sir, my heart begins to fail me," replied Louise, endeavouring to suppress her tears. "My poor father! What if the present trial fail?" "Nay, nay, keep up your courage. I am most sanguine of success in the scheme I have long meditated for the restoration of your father's reason. Now, then, all you have to do for the present is carefully to attend to my directions." So saying, the doctor, quitting his party, entered a small chamber, whose grated window looked into the garden. Thanks to rest, care, sufficiency of nourishing diet, Morel was no longer the pale, careworn, haggard creature that had entered those walls. The tinge of health began to colour his before jaundiced cheek, but a melancholy smile, a fixed, motionless gaze, as though on some object for ever present to his mental view, proved too plainly that reason had not entirely resumed her empire over him. When the doctor entered, Morel was sitting at a table, imitating the movements of a lapidary at his wheel. "I must work," murmured he, "and hard, too. 1,300 francs! Ay, 1,300 is the sum required, or poor Louise will be dragged to a scaffold. That must not be. No, no. Her father will work. 1,300 francs. Right. Morel, my good fellow, said the doctor, gently advancing towards him, don't work so very hard. There is no occasion now. You know that you have earned the 1,300 francs you require to free Louise. See, here they are. And with these words the doctor laid a handful of gold on the table. Saved! Louise saved! Exclaimed the lapidary, catching up the money and hurrying towards the door. Then I will carry it at once to the notary. Come, called out the doctor, in considerable trepidation, for well he knew the success of his experiment depended on the manner in which the mind of the lapidary received its first shock. Scarcely had the doctor pronounced the signal than Louise sprang forwards, and presented herself at the door just as her father reached it. Bewildered and amazed, Morel let fall the gold he clutched in his hands, and retreated in visible surprise. For some minutes he continued gazing on his daughter with a stupefied and vacant stare, but by degrees his memory seemed to awaken, and, cautiously approaching her, he examined her features with a timid and restless curiosity. Poor Louise, trembling with emotion, could scarcely restrain her tears; but a sign from the doctor made her exert herself to repress any manifestation of feeling calculated to disturb the progress of her parent's thoughts. Meanwhile Morel, bending over his daughter, and peering, with uneasy scrutiny, into her countenance, became very pale, pressed his hands to his brows, and then wiped away the large damp drops that had gathered there. Drawing closer and closer to the agitated girl, he strove to speak to her, but the words expired on his lips. His paleness increased, and he gazed around him with the bewildered air of a person awakening from a troubled dream. Good, good, whispered the doctor to Louise. Now, when I say, come, throw yourself into his arms and call him father. The lapidary, pressing his 2 hands on his breast, again commenced examining the individual before him from head to foot, as if determined to satisfy his mind as to her identity. His features expressed a painful uncertainty, and instead of continuing to watch the features of his daughter, he seemed as if trying to hide himself from her sight, saying in a low, murmuring, broken tone, No, no, it is a dream. Where am I? It is impossible. I dream. It cannot be she. Then, observing the gold strewed on the floor, he cried, And this gold? I do not remember. Am I then awake? Oh, my head is dizzy. I dare not look. I am ashamed. She is not my Louise. Come, cried the doctor in a loud voice. Father, dearest father, exclaimed Louise, do you not know your child, your poor Louise? And as she said these words she threw herself on the lapidary's neck, while the doctor motioned for the rest of the group to advance. Gracious heavens! exclaimed Morel, while Louise loaded him with caresses. Where am I? What has happened to me? Who are all these persons? Oh, I dare not believe the reality of what I see. Then, after a short silence, he abruptly took the head of Louise between his 2 hands, gazed earnestly and searchingly at her for some moments, then cried, in a voice tremulous with emotion, Louise! He is saved, said the doctor. My dear Morel, my dear husband, exclaimed the lapidary's wife, mingling her caresses with those of her daughter. My wife, my child and wife, both here? cried Morel. Pray, don't overlook the rest of your friends, Monsieur Morel, said Rigolette, advancing. See, we have all come to visit you at once. I, for one, am delighted to renew my acquaintance with the worthy Monsieur Morel, said Germain, coming forward and extending his hand. And your old acquaintances at the lodge beg that they may not be overlooked, chimed in Anastasie, leading Alfred up to the astonished and delighted lapidary. You know us, don't you, Monsieur Morel? The Pipelets, the hearty old Pipelets, and your everlasting friends? Come, pluck up your courage, and look about you, Monsieur Morel. Hang it all! Daddy Morel, here is a happy meeting. May we see many such? Allez donc! Monsieur Pipelet and his wife, everybody here. It seems to me so long since. But no matter. 'Tis you, Louise, my child? 'Tis you, is it not?" exclaimed he, joyfully pressing his daughter in his arms. "Oh, yes, my dearest father, 'tis your own poor Louise. And there is my mother. Here are all our kind friends. You will never quit us more, never know sorrow or care again, and henceforward we shall all be happy and prosperous." "Happy? Let me try and recollect a little of past things. I seem to have a faint recollection of your being taken to prison, and then, Louise, all seems a blank and confusion here," continued Morel, pressing his hand to his temples. "Never mind all that, dearest father. I am here and innocent. Let that comfort and console you." Stay! That note of hand I gave. And now I remember it all," cried the lapidary, with shuddering horror. Then, in a voice of assumed calmness, he said, "And what has become of the notary?" "He is dead, dearest father," murmured Louise. "Dead? He dead? Then indeed I may hope for happiness. But where am I? How came I here? How long have I left my home, and wherefore was I brought hither? I have no recollection of any of these things." "You were extremely ill," said the doctor, "and you were brought here for air and good nursing. You have had a severe fever, and been at times a little light-headed." Yes, I recollect now. And when I was taken ill I remember I was talking to my daughter, and some other person." "Who could it be?" "Ah, now I know. A kind, good man, named M. Rodolph, who saved me from being arrested. Afterwards, strange to say, I cannot recall a single circumstance." "Your illness was attended with an entire absence of memory," said the doctor. "And in whose house am I now?" "In that of your friend M. Rodolph," interposed Germain, hastily. "It was thought that country air would be serviceable to you, and promote your recovery." "Excellent!" said the doctor in a low tone; then, speaking to a keeper who stood near him, he said, "Send the coach around to the garden gate to prevent the necessity of taking our recovered patient through the different courts, filled with those less fortunate than himself." As frequently occurs in cases of madness, Morel had not the least idea or recollection of the aberration of intellect under which he had suffered. Shortly afterwards, Morel, with his wife and daughter, ascended the fiacre, attended also by a surgeon of the establishment, who, for precaution's sake, was charged to see him comfortably settled in his abode ere he left him. And in this order, and followed by a second carriage, conveying their friends, the lapidary quitted Bicêtre without entertaining the most remote suspicion of ever having entered it. "And do you consider this poor man effectually cured?" asked Madame Georges of the doctor as he led her to the coach. "I hope so, at least; and I wish to leave him wholly to the beneficial effects of rejoining his family, from whom it would now be almost dangerous to attempt to separate him. Added to which, one of my pupils will remain with him and give the necessary directions for his regimen and treatment. I shall visit him myself daily, until his cure is confirmed, for not only do I feel much interested in him, but he was most particularly recommended to me when he first came here by the chargé d'affaires of the Grand Duke of Gerolstein." A look of intelligence was exchanged between Germain and his mother. Much affected with all they had seen and heard, the party now took leave of the doctor, reiterating their gratification at having been present during so gratifying a scene, and their grateful acknowledgments for the politeness he had shown them in conducting them over the establishment. As the doctor was re-entering the house, he was met by one of the superior officers of the place, who said to him, "Ah, my dear M. Herbin, you cannot imagine the scene I have just witnessed. It would have afforded an inexhaustible fund of reflection for so skilful an observer as yourself." "To what do you allude?" "You are aware that we have here two females, a mother and a daughter, who are condemned to death, and that their execution is fixed for to morrow. Well, in my life, I never witnessed such a cool indifference as that displayed by the mother. She must be a female fiend." "You allude to the widow Martial, I presume. What fresh act of daring has she committed?" You shall hear. She had requested permission to share her daughter's cell until the final moment arrived. Her wish was complied with. Her daughter, far less hardened than her parent, appeared to feel contrition as the hour of execution approached, while the diabolical assurance of the old woman seemed, if possible, to augment. Just now, the venerable chaplain of the prison entered their dungeon to offer them the consolations of religion. The daughter was about to accept them, when the mother, without for one instant losing her coolness or frigid self-possession, began to assail the chaplain with such insulting and derisive language that the venerable priest was compelled to quit the cell, after trying in vain to induce the violent and unmanageable woman to listen to one word he said. It is a fearful fact connected with this family that a sort of depravity seems to pervade it. The father was executed, a son is now in the galleys, a second has only escaped a public and disgraceful end by flight, while the eldest son and 2 young children have alone been able to resist this atmosphere of moral contagion. What a singular circumstance connected with this double execution it is that the day of Mid-Lent should have been selected. At 7 o'clock tomorrow, the hour fixed, the streets will be filled with groups of masqueraders, who, having passed the night at the different balls and places of entertainment beyond the barriers, will be just returning home. Added to which, at the place of execution, the Barrière Saint-Jacques, the noise of the revels still being kept up in honour of the carnival can be distinctly heard. The following morning's sun rose bright and cloudless. At 4 o'clock in the morning various troops of soldiers surrounded the approaches to Bicêtre. We shall now return to Calabash and her mother in their dungeon. End of Chapter 8. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 9 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Toilet. The condemned cell of Bicêtre was situated at the end of a gloomy passage, into which a trifling portion of light and air was admitted by means of small gratings led into the lower part of the wall. The cell itself would have been wholly dark but for a kind of wicket, let into the upper part of the door which opened into the corridor before mentioned. In this wretched dungeon, whose crumbling ceiling, damp, mouldy walls, and stone-paved floors struck a death chill like that of the grave, were confined the widow Martial and her daughter Calabash. The harsh, angular features of the widow stood out amidst the imperfect light of the place, cold, pale, and immovable as those of a marble statue. Deprived of the use of her hands, which were fastened beneath her black dress by the strait waistcoat of the prison, formed of a coarse grey cloth and tightly secured behind her, she requested her cap be taken off, complaining of an oppression and burning sensation in her head. This done, a mass of long, grizzled hair fell over her shoulders. Seated on the side of her bed, she gazed earnestly and fixedly at her daughter, who was separated from her by the width of the dungeon, and, wearing like her mother the customary strait waistcoat, was partly reclining and partly supporting herself against the wall, her head bent forward on her breast, her eye dull and motionless, and her breathing quick and irregular. From time to time, a convulsive tremor rattled her lower jaw, while her features, spite of their livid hue, remained comparatively calm and tranquil. Within the cell, and immediately beneath the wicket of the entrance door, was seated an old, grey-headed soldier, whose rough, sunburnt features betokened his having felt the scorch of many climes, and borne his part in numerous campaigns. His duty was to keep constant watch over the condemned prisoners. "How piercing cold it is here!" exclaimed Calabash. "Yet my eyes burn in my head, and I have a burning, quenchless thirst." Then, addressing the bald-headed veteran, she said, "Water! Pray give me a drink of water." The old soldier filled a cup of water from a pitcher placed near him, and held it to her lips. Eagerly swallowing the draught, she bowed her head in token of thankfulness, and the soldier proceeded to offer the same beverage to the mother. "Would you not like to moisten your lips?" asked he, kindly. With a rough, repulsive gesture, she intimated her disinclination, and the old man sat down again. "What's o'clock?" inquired Calabash. "Nearly 4:30, replied the soldier. "Only 3 hours," replied Calabash, with a sinister and gloomy smile. 3 hours more, and then—" She could proceed no further. The widow shrugged up her shoulders. Her daughter divined her meaning, and said, "Ah, mother, you have so much more courage than I have. You never give way, you don't." "Never." "I see it, and I know you too well to expect it. You look at this moment as calm and collected as if we were sitting sewing by our own fireside. Ah, those happy days are gone, gone for ever." "Folly! Why prate thus?" "Nay, mother, I cannot bear to rest shut up with my own wretched thoughts. It relieves my heart to talk of bygone times, when I little expected to come to this." "Mean, cowardly creature!" "I know I am a coward, mother. I am afraid to die. Every one cannot boast of your resolution. I do not possess it. I have tried as much as I could to imitate you. I refused to listen to the priest because you did not like it. Still, I may have been wrong in sending the holy man away. For," added the wretched creature with a shudder, "who can tell what is after death? Mother, do you hear me? After, I say, and it only wants—" "Exactly 3 hours, and you will know all about it." "How can you speak so indifferently on such a dreadful subject?" "Yet true enough. In 3 short hours, we who now sit talking to each other, who, if at liberty, should ail nothing, but be ready to enjoy life, must die." "Oh, mother, can you not say one word to comfort me?" "Be bold, girl, and die as you have lived, a true Martial." "You should not talk thus to your daughter," interposed the old soldier with a serious air. "You would have acted more like a parent had you allowed her to listen to the priest when he came." Again the widow contemptuously shrugged her shoulders, and, without deigning to notice the soldier further than by bestowing on him a look of withering contempt, she repeated to Calabash, "Pluck up your courage, my girl, and let the world see that women have more courage than men, with their priests and cowardly nonsense. General Leblond was one of the bravest officers of the regiment he belonged to. Well, this dauntless man fell at the siege of Saragossa, covered with wounds, and his last expiring act was to sign himself with the cross," said the veteran. "I served under him. I only tell you this to prove that to die with a prayer on your lips is no sign of cowardice." Calabash eyed the bronze features of the speaker with deep attention. The scarred and weather-beaten countenance of the old man told of a life passed in scenes of danger and of death, encountered with calm bravery. To hear those wrinkled lips urging the necessity of prayer, and associating religion with the memory of the good and valiant, made the miserable, vacillating culprit think that, after all, there could be no cowardice in recommending one's soul to the God who gave it, and breathing a repentant supplication for the past. "Alas! Alas!" cried she, "why did I not attend to what the priest had to say to me? It could not have done me any harm, and it might have given me courage to face that dreadful afterwards, that makes death so terrible." "What, again?" exclaimed the widow, with bitter contempt. "'Tis a pity time does not permit of your becoming a nun. The arrival of your brother Martial will complete your conversion; but that honest man and excellent son will think it sinful to come and receive the last wishes of his dying mother." As the widow uttered these last words, the huge lock of the prison was heard to turn with a loud sound, and then the door to open. "So soon!" shrieked Calabash, with a convulsive bound. "Surely the time here is wrong. It cannot be the hour we were told. Oh, mother, mother! Must we die at least 2 hours before we expected?" "So much the better, if the executioner's watch deceives me. It will put an end to your whining folly, which disgraces the name you bear." "Madame," said an officer of the prison, gently opening the door, "your son is here. Will you see him?" "Yes," replied the widow, without turning her head. Martial entered the cell, the door of which was left open, that those without in the corridor might be within hearing, if summoned by the old soldier, who still remained with the prisoners. Through the gloom of the corridor, lighted only by the faint beams of the early morning, and the dubious twinkling of a single lamp, several soldiers and gaolers might be seen, the former standing in due military order, the latter sitting on benches. Martial looked as pale and ghastly as his mother, while his features betrayed the mental agony he suffered at witnessing so afflicting a sight. Still, spite of all it cost him, as well as the recollection of his mother's crimes and openly expressed aversion for himself, he had felt it imperatively his duty to come and receive her last commands. No sooner was he in the dungeon than the widow, fixing on him a sharp, penetrating look, said in a tone of concentrated wrath and bitterness, with a view to rouse all the evil passions of her son's mind, "Well, you see what the good people are going to do with your mother and sister." "Ah, mother, how dreadful! Alas, alas! Have I not warned you that such would be the end?" Interrupting him while her lips became blanched with rage, the widow exclaimed, "Enough! 'Tis sufficient that your mother and sister are about to be murdered, as your father was." "Merciful God!" cried Martial, "and to think that I have no power to prevent it! 'Tis past all human interference. What would you have me do? Alas! Had you or my sister attended to what I said, you would not now have been here." "Oh, no doubt," returned the widow, with her usual tone of savage irony. "To you the spectacle of mine and your sister's sufferings is a matter of delight to your proud heart. You can now tell the world without a lie that your mother is dead. You will have to blush for her no more." "Had I been wanting in my duty as a son," answered Martial, indignant at the unjust sarcasms of his mother, "I should not now be here." "You came but from curiosity. Own the truth if you dare." "No, mother. You desired to see me, and I obeyed your wish." "Ah, Martial!" cried Calabash, unable longer to struggle against the agonising terror she endured, "had I but listened to your advice, instead of being led by my mother, I should not be here." Then, losing all further control of herself, she exclaimed, "'Tis all your fault, accursed mother! Your bad example and evil counsel have brought me to what I am." "Do you hear her?" said the widow, bursting into a fiendish laugh. "Come, this will repay you for the trouble of paying us a last visit. Your excellent sister has turned pious, repents of her own sins, and curses her mother." Without making any reply to this unnatural speech, Martial approached Calabash, whose dying agonies seemed to have commenced, and regarding her with deep compassion, said, "My poor sister! Alas, it is now too late to recall the past." "It is never too late to turn coward, it seems," cried the widow, with savage excitement. "Oh, what a race you are! Happily Nicholas has escaped. François and Amandine will slip through your fingers. They have already imbibed vice enough, and want and misery will finish them." "Oh, Martial!" groaned forth Calabash, "for the love of God, take care of those two poor children, lest they come to such an end as mother's and mine." "He may watch over them as much as he likes," cried the widow, with settled hatred in her looks. "Vice and destitution will have greater effect than his words, and some of these days they will avenge their father, mother, and sister." "Your horrible expectations, mother, will never be fulfilled," replied the indignant Martial. "Neither my young brother, sister, nor self have anything to fear from want. La Louve saved the life of the young girl Nicholas tried to drown, and the relations of the young person offered us either a large sum of money or a smaller sum in some land at Algiers. We preferred the latter, and to morrow we quit Europe, with the children, for ever." "Is that absolutely true?" asked the widow of Martial, in a tone of angry surprise. "Mother, when did I ever tell you a falsehood?" "You are doing so now to try and put me into a passion." "What, displeased to learn that your children are provided for?" "Yes, to find that my young wolves are to be turned into lambs, and to hear that the blood of father, mother, and sister have no prospect of being avenged." "Do not talk so, at a moment like this." "I have murdered and am murdered in my turn. The account is even, at any rate." "Mother, mother, let me beseech you to repent ere you die." Again a peal of fiendish laughter burst from the pallid lips of the condemned woman. "For 30 years," cried she, "have I lived in crime. Would you have me believe that 30 years' guilt is to be repented of in 3 days, with the mind disturbed and distracted by the near approach of death? No, no, 3 days cannot effect such wonders. And I tell you, when my head falls its last expression will be rage and hatred." "Brother, brother!" ejaculated Calabash, whose brain began to wander. "Help, help! Take me from hence!" moaned she in an expiring voice. "They are coming to fetch me, to kill me. Oh, hide me, dear brother, hide me, and I will love you evermore." "Will you hold your tongue?" cried the widow, exasperated at the weakness betrayed by her daughter. "Will you be silent? Oh, you base, you disgraceful creature! And to think that I should be obliged to call myself your parent!" "Mother," exclaimed Martial, nearly distracted by this horrid scene, "will you tell me why you sent for me?" "Because I thought to give you heart and hatred. But he who has not the one cannot entertain the other. Go, coward, go!" At this moment a loud sound of many footsteps was heard in the corridor. The old soldier looked at his watch. A rich ray of the golden brightness which marked the rising of that day's sun found its way through the loopholes in the walls and shed a flood of light into the very midst of the wretched cell, rendered now completely illumined by means of the opening of the door at the opposite end of the passage to that in which the condemned cell was situated. In the midst of this blaze of day appeared 2 gaolers, each bearing a chair. An officer also made his appearance, saying to the widow in a voice of sympathy, "Madame, the hour has arrived." The mother arose on the instant, erect and immovable, while Calabash uttered the most piercing cries. Then 4 more persons entered the cell. 4 of the number, who were very shabbily dressed, bore in their hands packets of fine but very strong cord. The taller man of the party was dressed in black, with a large cravat. He handed a paper to the officer. This individual was the executioner, and the paper a receipt signifying his having received 2 females for the purpose of guillotining them. The man then took sole charge of these unhappy creatures, and from that moment was responsible for them. To the wild terror and despair which had first seized Calabash, now succeeded a kind of stupefaction, and so nearly insensible was she that the assistant executioners were compelled to seat her on her bed, and to support her when there. Her firmly closed jaws scarcely enabled her to utter a sound, but her hollow eyes rolled vacantly in their sockets, her chin fell listlessly on her breast, and but for the support of the 2 men, she would have fallen forwards a lifeless, senseless mass. After having bestowed a last embrace on his wretched sister, Martial stood petrified with terror, unable to speak or move, and as though perfectly spellbound by the horrible scene before him. The cool audacity of the widow did not for an instant forsake her. With head erect and firm, collected manner, she assisted in taking off the strait waistcoat she had worn, and which had hitherto fettered her movements. This removed, she appeared in an old black stuff dress. "Where shall I place myself?" asked she, in a clear, steady voice. "Be good enough to sit down upon one of those chairs," said the executioner, pointing to the seats arranged at the entrance of the dungeon. With unfaltering step, the widow prepared to follow the directions given her, but as she passed her daughter, she said, in a voice that betokened some little emotion, "Kiss me, my child." But as the sound of her mother's voice reached her ear, Calabash seemed suddenly to wake up from her lethargy. She raised her head, and, with a wild and almost frenzied cry, exclaimed, "Away! Leave me! And if there be a hell, may it receive you!" "My child," repeated the widow, "let us embrace for the last time." "Do not approach me!" cried the distracted girl, violently repulsing her mother. "You have been my ruin in this world and the next." "Then forgive me ere I die." "Never, never!" exclaimed Calabash; and then, totally exhausted by the effort she had made, she sank back in the arms of the assistants. A cloud passed over the hitherto stern features of the widow, and a moisture was momentarily visible on her glowing eyeballs. At this instant she encountered the pitying looks of her son. After a trifling hesitation, during which she seemed to be undergoing some powerful internal conflict, she said, "And you?" Sobbing violently, Martial threw himself into his mother's arms. "Enough!" said the widow, conquering her emotion, and withdrawing herself from the close embrace of her son. "I am keeping this gentleman waiting," pointing to the executioner. Then, hurrying towards a chair, she resolutely seated herself, and the gleam of maternal sensibility she had exhibited was for ever extinguished. "Do not stay here," said the old soldier, approaching Martial with an air of kindness. "Come this way," continued he, leading him, while Martial, stupefied by horror, followed him mechanically. The almost expiring Calabash having been supported to a chair by the two assistants, one sustained her all but inanimate form, while the other tied her hands behind with fine but excessively strong whipcord, knotted into the most inextricable meshes, while with a cord of the same description he secured her feet, allowing her just so much liberty as would enable her to proceed slowly to her last destination. The widow having borne a similar pinioning with the most imperturbable composure, the executioner, drawing from his pocket a pair of huge scissors, said to her with considerable civility, "Be good enough to stoop your head, madame." Yielding immediate obedience to the request, the widow said, "We have been good customers to you. You have had my husband in your hands, and now you have his wife and daughter." Without making any reply, the executioner began to cut the long gray hairs of the prisoner very close, especially at the nape of the neck. "This makes the third time in my life," continued the widow with a dismal smile, "that I have had my head dressed by a professor. When I took my first communion the white veil was arranged; then on my marriage, when the orange flowers were placed there; and upon the present occasion, upon my word, I hardly know which became me most. You cannot guess what I am thinking of," resumed the widow, addressing the executioner, after having again contemplated her daughter. But the man made her no sort of answer, and no sound was heard but that of the scissors and the sort of convulsive and hysterical sob that occasionally escaped from Calabash. At this moment a venerable priest approached the governor, and addressed him in a low, earnest voice, the import of which was to express his desire to make an effort to rescue the souls of the condemned. "I was thinking that at 5 years old, my daughter, whose head you are going to cut off, was the prettiest child I ever saw, with her fair hair and red cheeks. Who that saw her then would have said that—" She was silent for a moment, and then said, with a burst of indescribable laughter, "What a farce is destiny!" At this moment the last of her hair was cut off. "I have done, madame," said the executioner, politely. "Many thanks, and I recommend my son Nicholas to you," said the widow. "You will cut off his hair some day." A turnkey came in and said a few words to her in a low tone. "No, I have already said no," she answered, angrily. The priest, hearing these words, and seeing any further interference useless, immediately withdrew. "Madame, we are all ready to go. Will you take anything?" inquired the executioner, civilly. "No, I thank you. This evening I shall take a mouthful of earth." And after this remark, the widow rose firmly. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a rope was also attached to each ankle, allowing her sufficient liberty to walk. Although her step was firm and resolute, the executioner and his assistant offered to support her; but she turned to them disdainfully, and said, "Do not touch me. I have a steady eye and a firm foot, and they will hear on the scaffold whether or not I have a good voice." Calabash was carried away in a dying state. After having traversed the long corridor, the funereal cortège ascended a stone staircase which led to an exterior court, where was a picket of gendarmes, a hackney coach, and a long, narrow carriage with a yellow body, drawn by 3 post horses, who were neighing loudly. "We shall not be full inside," said the widow, as she took her seat. The 2 vehicles, preceded and followed by the picket of gendarmes, then quitted the outer gate of Bicêtre, and went quickly towards the Boulevard Saint-Jacques. Chapter 9. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 10 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Martial and the Chourineur. Before we proceed, we have a few words to say as to the acquaintance recently established between the Chourineur and Martial. When Germain had left the prison, the Chourineur proved very easily that he had robbed himself, and, making a statement of his motive for his singular mystification to the magistrate, he was set at liberty, after having been severely admonished. Desirous of recompensing the Chourineur for this fresh act of devotion, Rodolph, in order to realize the wishes of his rough protégé, had lodged him in the hotel of the Rue Plumet, promising that he should accompany him on his return to Germany. The Chourineur's blind attachment to Rodolph was like that of a dog for his master. When, however, the prince had found his daughter, all was changed, and, in spite of his warm gratitude for the man who had saved his life, he could not make up his mind to take with him to Germany the witness of Fleur de Marie's fallen state. Yet, determined to carry out the Chourineur's wishes, he sent for him, and told him that he had still another service to ask of him. At this the Chourineur's countenance brightened up, but he was greatly distressed when he learned that he must quit the hotel that very day, and would not accompany the prince to Germany. It is useless to mention the munificent compensations which Rodolph offered to the Chourineur, the money he intended for him, the farm in Algeria, anything he could desire. The Chourineur was wounded to the heart, refused, and, perhaps for the first time in his life, wept. Rodolph was compelled to force his presence on him. Next day the prince sent for La Louve and Martial, and inquired what he could do for them. Remembering what Fleur de Marie had told him of the wild taste of La Louve and her husband, he proposed to the hardy couple either a considerable sum of money, or half the sum, and land in full cultivation adjoining the farm he had bought for the Chourineur, believing that by bringing them together they would sympathise, from their desire to seek solitude, the one in consequence of the past, and the other from the crimes of his family. He was not mistaken. Martial and La Louve accepted joyfully, and then, talking the matter over with the Chourineur, they all rejoiced in the prospects held out to them in Algeria. A sincere good feeling soon united the future colonists. Persons of their class judge quickly of each other, and like one another as speedily. The Chourineur accompanied his new friend Martial to the Bicêtre, and awaited him in the hackney coach which conducted them back to Paris, after Martial, horror-struck, had left the dungeon of his mother and sister. The countenance of the Chourineur had completely changed. The bold expression and jovial humour which usually characterised his harsh features had given way to extreme dejection. His voice had lost something of its coarseness. A grief of heart, until then unknown to him, had broken down his energetic temperament. He looked kindly at Martial, and said, "Courage! You have done all that good intentions could do. It is ended. Think now of your wife, and the children whom you have prevented from becoming criminals like their father and mother. To-night we leave Paris never to return to it, and you will never again hear of what so much distresses you now." "True, true. But, after all, they are my sister and mother." "Yes, but when things must be, we must submit," said the Chourineur, checking a deep sigh. After a moment's silence, Martial said kindly, "And I ought in my turn to try and console you who are so sad. My wife and I hope that when we have left Paris this will cease." "Yes," said the Chourineur, with a shudder, "if I leave Paris." "Why, we go this evening." "Yes, you do. You go this evening." "And have you changed your intention, then?" "No, yet, Martial, you'll laugh at me. But yet, I will tell you all. If anything happens to me, it will prove that I am not deceived. When M. Rodolph asked if we could go to Algeria together, I told you my mind at once, and also what I had been." "Yes, you did. Let us mention it no more. You underwent your punishment, and are now as good as any one. But, like myself, I can imagine you would like to go and live a long way off, instead of living here, where, however honest we may be, They might at times fling in your teeth a misdeed you have atoned for and repented, and in mine, my parents' crimes, for which I am by no means responsible. The past is the past between us, and we shall never reproach each other. With you and me, Martial, the past is the past, but you see, Martial, there is something above. I have killed a man. A great misfortune, assuredly, but at the moment you were out of your senses, mad. And besides, you have since saved the lives of other persons, and that will count in your favour. I'll tell you why I refer to my misdeed. I used to have a dream, in which I saw the sergeant I killed. I have not had it for a long time until last night, and that foretells some misfortune for to-day. I have a foreboding that I shall not quit Paris. Oh, you regret at leaving our benefactor. The thought of coming with me to the Bicêtre agitated you, and so your dream recurred to you. The Chourineur shook his head sorrowfully, and said, "It has come to me just as M. Rodolph is going to start, for he goes to-day. Yesterday I sent a messenger to his hotel, not daring to go myself. They sent me word that he went this morning at 11 o'clock by the barrier of Charenton, and I mean to go and station myself there to try and see him once more, for the last time. He seems so good that I easily understand your love for him." "Love for him!" said the Chourineur, with deep and concentrated emotion. "Yes, yes, Martial. To lie on the earth, eat black bread, be his dog, to be where he was, I asked no more. But that was too much. He would not consent. He has been very generous towards you. Yet it is not for that I love him, but because he told me I had heart and honour. Yes, and that at a time when I was as fierce as a brute beast. And he made me understand what was good in me, and that I had repented, and after suffering a great misery, had worked hard for an honest livelihood, although all the world considered me as a thorough ruffian. And so, when M. Rodolph said these words to me, my heart beat high and proudly, and from this time I would go through fire and water to serve him." "Why, it is because you are better than you were that you ought not to have any of those forebodings. Your dream is nothing." "We shall see. I shall not try and get into any mischief, for I cannot have any worse misfortune than not to see again M. Rodolph, whom I hope never again to leave. I should have been in my way, you see, always with him, body and soul, always ready. Never mind, perhaps he was wrong. I am only a worm at his feet. But sometimes, Martial, the smallest may be useful to the greatest. One day, perhaps, you may see him." "Oh, no, he said to me, 'My good fellow, you must promise never to seek nor see me. That will be doing me a service.' So, of course, Martial, I promised; and I'll keep my word, though it is very hard. Once at Algeria, you will forget all your vexations." "Yes, yes, I'm an old trooper, Martial, and will face the Bedouins." "Come, come, you'll soon recover your spirits. We'll farm and hunt together, and live together, or separate, just as you like. We'll bring up the children like honest people, and you shall be their uncle; for we are brothers, and my wife is good at heart. And so we'll be happy, eh?" And Martial extended his hand to the Chourineur. "So we will, Martial," was the reply; "and my sorrow will kill me, or I shall kill my sorrow." "It will not kill you. We shall pass our days together, and every evening we will say, 'Brother, thanks to M. Rodolph.' That shall be our prayer to him." "Martial, you comfort me." "Well, then, that is all right; and as to that stupid dream, you will think no more of it, I hope." "I'll try." "Well, then, you'll come to us at 4 o'clock. The diligence goes at 5. "Agreed. But I will get out here and walk to the barrier at Charenton, where I will await M. Rodolph, that I may see him pass." The coach stopped, and the Chourineur alighted. CHAPTer 10. Read by Céline Major. Chapter 11 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Finger of Providence. The Chourineur had forgotten that it was the day after Mid Lent, and was consequently greatly surprised at the sight, at once hideous and singular, which presented itself to his view when he arrived at the exterior boulevard, which he was traversing to reach the barrier of Charenton. He found himself suddenly in the thickest of a dense throng of people who were coming out of the cabaret of the Faubourg de la Glacière, in order to reach the Boulevard St. Jacques, where the execution was to take place. Although it was broad daylight, there was still heard the noisy music of the public houses, whence issued particularly the loud echoes of the cornet à piston. The pencil of Callot, of Rembrandt, or of Goya, is requisite to limn the strange, hideous, and fantastical appearance of this multitude. Almost all of them, men, women, and children, were attired in old masquerade costumes. Those who could not afford this expense had on their clothes rags of bright colours. Some young men were dressed in women's clothes, half torn and soiled with mud. All their countenances, haggard from debauchery and vice, and furrowed by intoxication, sparkled with savage delight at the idea that, after a night of filthy orgies, they should see two women executed on the scaffold prepared for them. The foul and fetid scum of the population of Paris, this vast mob, was formed of thieves and abandoned women, who every day tax crime for their daily bread, and every evening return to their lairs with their vicious spoils. Note 1. It is calculated that there are in Paris 30,000 persons who have no other means of existence but theft. The crowd entirely choked up the means of circulation, and in spite of his gigantic strength, the Chourineur was compelled to remain almost motionless in the midst of this compact throng. He was, however, willing to remain so, as the prince would not pass the barrier of Charenton until 11 o'clock, and it was not yet 7, and he had a singular spectacle before him. In a large, low apartment, occupied at one end by musicians, surrounded by benches and tables laden with the fragments of a repast, broken plates, empty bottles, etc., a dozen men and women, in various disguises and half drunk, were dancing with the utmost excitement that frantic and obscene dance called la chahut. Amongst the dissipated revellers who figured in the Saturnalia, the Chourineur remarked two couples who obtained the most overwhelming applause, from the revolting grossness of their attitudes, their gesticulations, and their language. The first couple consisted of a man disguised as a bear, and nearly covered with a waistcoat and trousers of black sheepskin. The head of the animal, being too troublesome to carry, had been replaced by a kind of hood with long hair, which entirely covered his features. 2 holes for his eyes, and a long one for his mouth allowed him to see, speak, and breathe. This man, one of the prisoners escaped from La Force, amongst whom were Barbillon and the 2 murderers arrested at the ogress's at the tapis franc at the beginning of this recital, this man so masked was Nicolas Martial, the son and brother of the 2 women for whom the scaffold was prepared but a few paces distant. Induced into this act of atrocious insensibility and infamous audacity by one of his associates, this wretch had dared with this disguise to join in the last revels of the carnival. The woman who danced with him, dressed as a vivandière, wore a round leather cap with ragged ribbons, a kind of bodice of threadbare red cloth, ornamented with 3 rows of brass buttons, a green skirt, and trousers of white calico. Her black hair fell in disorder all about her head, and her haggard and swollen features evinced the utmost effrontery and immodesty. The vis-à-vis of these dancers were no less disgusting. The man, who was very tall, and disguised as Robert Macaire, had so begrimed his features with soot that it was impossible to recognise him, and besides a large bandage covered his left eye. The white of the right eye, being thus the more heightened, rendered him still more hideous. The lower part of the skeleton's countenance, for it was he, disappeared in a high neckcloth made of an old red shawl. Wearing an old, white, napless hat with a crushed side, dirty and without a crown, a green coat in rags, and tight mulberry-coloured pantaloons, patched in every direction, and tied around the instep with pieces of pack-thread, this assassin outraged the most outré and revolting attitudes of the chahut, darting from right to left, before and behind, his lanky limbs as hard as steel, and twisting and twining, and springing and bounding with such vigour and elasticity, that he seemed set in motion by steel springs. A worthy coryphée of this filthy saturnalia, his lady partner, a tall and active creature with impudent and flushed features, attired en débardeur, wore a flat cap on one side of a powdered wig with a thick pigtail, a waistcoat and trousers of worn green velvet, adjusted to her shape by an orange scarf, with long ends flowing down her back. A fat, vulgar, coarse woman, the brutal ogress of the tapis franc, was seated on one of the benches, holding on her knees the plaid cloaks of this creature and the vivandière, whilst they were rivalling the bounds and jumps and gross postures of the Skeleton and Nicholas Martial. Amongst the other dancers there was a lame boy, dressed like a devil, by means of a black net vest much too large for him, red drawers, and a green mask hideous and grotesque. In spite of his infirmity, this little monster was wonderfully agile, and his precocious depravity equalled, if it could not exceed, that of his detestable companions, and he gambolled as impudently as any of them before a fat woman, dressed as a shepherdess, who excited her partner the more by her shouts of laughter. No charge having been raised against Tortillard, our readers have recognised him, and Bras Rouge having been for the while left in prison, the boy, at his father's request, was reclaimed by Micou, the receiver of the passage of the Brasserie, who had not been denounced by his accomplices. As secondary figures in this picture, let imagination conceive all there is of the lowest, most shameful, and most monstrous in this idle, wanton, insolent, rapacious, atheistical, sanguinary assemblage of infamy, which is most hostile to social order, and to which we would call the attention of all thinking persons as our recital draws to a close. Excited by the shouts of laughter and the cheers of the mob assembled around the windows, the actors in the infamous dance cried to the orchestra for a finale galop. The musicians, delighted to reach the end of their labours, complied with the general wish, and played a gallopade with the utmost energy and rapidity. At this the excitement redoubled. The couples encircled each other and dashed away, following the Skeleton and his partner, who led off their infernal round amidst the wildest cries and acclamations. The crowd was so thick, so dense, and the evolutions so multiplied and rapid, that these creatures, inflamed with wine, exercise, and noise, their intoxication became delirious frenzy, and they soon ceased to have space for their movements. The Skeleton then cried in a breathless voice, "Look out at the door! We will go out on to the boulevard." "Yes, yes!" cried the mob at the windows. "A gallop as far as the Barrière Saint Jacques!" "The 2 Motts will soon be here." "The headsman cuts double." "How funny!" "Yes, with a cornet à piston accompaniment." "I'll ask the widow to be my partner." "And I the daughter." "Death to the informers!" "Long live the prigs and lads of steel!" cried the Skeleton in a voice of thunder, as he and the dancers, forcing their way in the midst of the mass, set the whole body in motion. And then were heard cries and imprecations and shouts of laughter, which had nothing human in their sound. Suddenly this uproar reached its height by 2 fresh incidents. The vehicle which contained the criminals, accompanied by its escort of cavalry, appeared at the angle of the boulevard, and then all the mob rushed in that direction, shouting and roaring with ferocious delight. At this moment, also, the crowd was met by a courier coming from the Boulevard des Invalides, and galloping towards the Barrière de Charenton. He was dressed in a light blue jacket with yellow collar, with a double row of silver lace down the seams, but as a mark of deep mourning, he wore black breeches and high boots. His cap, also, with a broad band of silver, was encircled with crape, and on the winkers of his horse were the arms of Gerolstein. He walked his horse, his advance becoming every moment more difficult, and he was almost obliged to stop when he found himself in the midst of the sea of people we have described. Although he called to them, and moved his horse with the greatest caution, cries, abuse, and threats were soon directed against him. "Does he want to ride us down, that vagabond?" "He's got lots of silver on his precious body," cried Tortillard. "If he comes against us, we'll make him alight and strip the tin off his jacket to go to the melters," said Nicholas. "And we'll take the seams out of your carcass if you are not careful, you cursed jockey," added the Skeleton, addressing the courier and seizing the bridle of his horse, for the crowd was so dense that the ruffian had given up his idea of dancing to the barrier. The courier, who was a powerful and resolute fellow, said to the Skeleton, lifting the handle of his whip, "If you do not let go my bridle, I'll lay my whip over you. Let me pass. My lord's carriage is coming close behind. Let me go forward, I say." "Your lord?" said the Skeleton. "What is your lord to me? I'll slit his weasand if I like. I never did for a lord. I should like to try my hand." "There are no more lords now. Vive la Charte!" shouted Tortillard; and as he said so he whistled a verse of the Parisienne, and clinging to one of the courier's legs nearly drew him out of his saddle. A blow with the handle of his whip on Tortillard's head punished his insolence. But the populace instantly attacked the courier, who in vain spurred his horse; he could not advance a step. Dismounted, amidst the shouts of the mob, he would have been murdered but for the arrival of Rodolph's carriage, which took off the attention of these wretches. The prince's travelling carriage, drawn by 4 horses, had for some time past advanced at only a foot pace, and one of the 2 footmen had got down from the rubble and was walking by the side of the door, which was very low. The postilion kept crying out to the people, and went forward very cautiously. Rodolph was dressed in deep mourning, as was also his daughter, one of whose hands he held in his own, looking at her with affection. The gentle and lovely face of Fleur de Marie was enclosed in a small capot of black crape, which heightened the dazzling brilliancy of her skin and the beautiful hue of her lovely brown hair, and the azure of this bright day was reflected in her large eyes, which had never been of more transparent and softened blue. Although her features wore a gentle smile, and expressed calmness and happiness when she looked at her father, yet a tinge of melancholy, and sometimes of undefinable sadness, threw its shadow over her countenance when her eyes were not fixed on her father. At this moment the carriage came amongst the crowd and began to slacken its pace. Rodolph lowered the window, and said in German to the lackey who was walking by the window, "Well, Frantz, what is the meaning of this?" "Monseigneur, there is such a crowd that the horses cannot move." "What has this assemblage collected for?" "Monseigneur, there is an execution going on." "Ah, frightful!" said Rodolph, throwing himself back at his carriage. "What is it, my dear father?" asked Fleur de Marie, with uneasiness. "Nothing, nothing, dearest." "Only listen! These threatening cries approach us. What can it be?" "Desire them to reach Charenton by another road," said Rodolph. "Monseigneur, it is too late. The crowd has stopped the horses." The footman could say no more. The mob, excited by the savage encouragement of the Skeleton and Nicholas, suddenly surrounded the carriage, and, in spite of the threats of the postilion, stopped the horses, and Rodolph saw on all sides threatening, furious countenances, and above them all the Skeleton, who came to the door of the carriage. "Take care, my dear father!" exclaimed Fleur de Marie, throwing her arms around Rodolph's neck. "Oh, you are the 'my lord,' are you?" said the Skeleton, thrusting his hideous head into the carriage. Had it not been for his daughter's presence, Rodolph would have given way to the natural impetuosity of his character at this insolence; but he controlled himself, and coolly replied, "What do you want, and why do you stop my carriage?" "Because we choose," said the Skeleton, "each in his turn. Yesterday you trampled on the mob, and to day the mob will crush you if you stir." "Father, we are lost!" murmured Fleur de Marie. "Take courage, love. I understand," replied the prince. "It is the last day of the carnival. These fellows are tipsy. I will get rid of them." "I say, my covey, come, get out, and your mott with you!" cried Nicholas. "Why should you trample upon a parcel of poor people?" "You seem to have drunk a good deal, and to desire to drink more," said Rodolph. "Here, take this, and do not delay my carriage any longer." And he threw out his purse, which Tortillard caught. "Oh, what? You are going to travel, eh? Well, then, you've got your pockets well lined, no doubt. Come, shell out my blade, or I'll have your life." And he opened the door suddenly. Rodolph's patience was exhausted. Alarmed for Fleur de Marie, whose alarm increased every moment, and believing that a display of vigour would daunt the wretch, whom he believed to be only drunk, he sprung from the carriage, intending to seize the Skeleton by the throat. The latter suddenly receded, and then, drawing a long knife dirk from his pocket, rushed at Rodolph. Fleur de Marie, seeing the dirk raised to stab her father, gave a shriek, sprung from the carriage, and threw her arms around him. Her father's life must have been sacrificed but for the Chourineur, who, at the commencement of this tumult, having recognised the livery of the prince, had contrived, by superhuman efforts, to reach the Skeleton. And at the moment when that ruffian menaced the prince with his knife, the Chourineur seized on his arm with one hand, and with the other grasping his collar, threw him backwards. Although surprised, and from behind too, the Skeleton turned around, and, recognising the Chourineur, cried, "What, the man in the gray blouse from La Force? This time, then, I'll do for you!" And, rushing furiously at the Chourineur, he plunged his knife in his breast. The Chourineur staggered, but did not fall. The crowd kept him on his legs. "The guard! Here come the guard!" exclaimed several voices in alarm. At these words, and at the sight of the murder of the Chourineur, all this dense crowd, fearing to be compromised in the assassination, dispersed as if by magic, and fled in every direction. The Skeleton, Nicholas, Martial, and Tortillard, amongst the earliest. When the guard came up, guided by the courier, who had escaped when the crowd had let him go to surround the prince's carriage, there only remained in this sad scene Rodolph, his daughter, and the Chourineur, bathed in his blood. The two servants of the prince had seated him on the ground with his back to a tree. All this passed more quickly than it can be described, and at a few paces from the guinguette from which the Skeleton and his band had issued. The prince, pale and agitated, held in his arms Fleur de Marie, half fainting, whilst the postilions were repairing the harness broken in the scuffle. "Quick!" said the prince to his servants engaged in aiding the Chourineur, "convey this poor fellow to the cabaret, and you," he added, turning to the courier, "get on the box, and gallop back for Dr. David at the hôtel. You will find him there, as he does not leave until 11 o'clock." The carriage went away at a great speed, and the two servants conveyed the Chourineur to the low apartment in which the orgies had taken place. Several of the women were still there. "My poor, dear child," said Rodolph to his daughter, "let me take you to some room in this place where you can await me, for I cannot abandon this brave fellow, who has again saved my life." "Oh, my dearest father, I entreat you, do not leave me!" exclaimed Fleur de Marie with alarm, and seizing Rodolph's arm. "Do not leave me alone! I should die with fright. Where you go, I will go." "But this frightful spectacle!" "Yes, thanks to this worthy man you still live for me, my father, and therefore allow me to join you in thanking and consoling him." The prince's perplexity was very great. His daughter evinced so much just fear of remaining alone in a room in this low haunt that he made up his mind to allow her to enter with him into the apartment, where they found the Chourineur. The mistress of the tavern and many of the women who had remained, and amongst whom was the ogress of the tapis franc, had hastily laid the wounded man on a mattress, and then stanched and bound his wound with napkins. The Chourineur opened his eyes as Rodolph entered. At the sight of the prince his features, pale with approaching death, became animated. He smiled painfully, and said in a low voice, "Ah, M. Rodolph, it was very fortunate I was there." "Brave and devoted as ever," said the prince, in an accent of despair, "again you have saved my life." "I was going to the barrier of Charenton, to try and see you go by, see you for the last time. Fortunately, I was unable to get in for the crowd. Besides, it was to happen. I told Martial so. I had a presentiment." "A presentiment?" "Yes, M. Rodolph, the dream of the sergeant last night." "Oh, try and forget such ideas. Let us hope the wound is not mortal." "Oh, yes, the Skeleton struck home. Never mind. I told Martial that a worm of the earth like me might sometimes be useful to a great lord like you." "But my life, I owe my life again to you." "We are quits, M. Rodolph. You told me that I had heart and honour. That word, you see. Oh, I am choking. Sir, without my asking, do me the honour to give me your hand. I feel I am sinking." "No, no, impossible!" exclaimed the prince, bending towards the Chourineur, and clasping in his hands the icy hand of the dying man. "No, you will live, you will live!" "M. Rodolph, there is something, you see, above. I killed with the blow of a knife. I die from the blow of a knife," said the Chourineur, who was sinking fast. At this moment his eyes turned towards Fleur de Marie, whom he had not before perceived. Amazement was depicted on his dying features. He made a movement, and said, "Ah, la Goualeuse!" "Yes, my daughter, who blesses you for having preserved her father." "She, your daughter, here? That reminds me of how our acquaintance began, M. Rodolph. And the blows with the fist? But this blow with the knife will be the last blow. I slashed, and in my turn am slashed, stabbed. It is just." He heaved a deep sigh. His head fell back. He was dead. The sound of horses without was heard. Rodolph's carriage had met that of Murphy and David, who, in their desire to rejoin the prince, had anticipated the hour fixed for their departure. "David," said Rodolph, wiping his eyes, and pointing to the Chourineur, "is there no hope?" "None, monseigneur," replied the doctor, after a moment's examination. During this moment there passed a mute and terrible scene between Fleur de Marie and the ogress, whom Rodolph had not observed. When the Chourineur had uttered the name of La Goualeuse, the ogress had raised her head and looked at Fleur de Marie. The horrid hag had already recognised Rodolph. He was called monseigneur. He called La Goualeuse his daughter. Such a metamorphosis astounded the ogress, who obstinately fixed her stupid, wondering eyes on her former victim. Fleur de Marie, pale and overcome, seemed fascinated by her gaze. The death of the Chourineur, the unexpected appearance of the ogress, which came to awaken more painfully than ever the remembrance of her former degradation, appeared to her a sinister presage. From this moment, Fleur de Marie was struck with one of those presentiments which, in dispositions like hers, have most frequently an irresistible influence. A few days after these events, and Rodolph and his daughter quitted Paris for ever. Chapter 11. Read by Céline Major. Epilogue, Chapter 1 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gerolstein. Prince Henry of Herrkausen, Oldenzaal, to the Count Maximilian Kaminetz. Oldenzaal, 25th August, 1840. I am just arrived from Gerolstein, where I have passed 3 months with the Grand Duke and his family. I expected to find a letter announcing your arrival at Oldenzaal, my dear Maximilian. Judge of my surprise, of my regret, on hearing that you will be detained in Hungary for several weeks. For more than 4 months I have been unable to write to you, not knowing where to direct my letters, thanks to your original and adventurous manner of travelling. You had, however, formally promised me at Vienna that you would be at Oldenzaal the 1st of August. I must then give up the pleasure of seeing you, and yet I have never had greater need of pouring forth my sorrows to you, Maximilian, my oldest friend, for although we are both of us still very young, our friendship is of long standing, as it dates from our childhood. What shall I say to you? During the last 3 months a complete revolution has taken place in me. I am at one of those moments that decide the existence of a man. Judge, then, how necessary your presence and your advice are to me. But you will not long be wanting, whatever motives you have for remaining in Hungary. Come, come, I entreat of you, Maximilian, for I stand in need of you to console me, and I cannot go to seek you. My father, whose health is daily declining, has summoned me from Gerolstein. Each day makes so great an alteration in him that it is impossible for me to leave him. I have so much to say that I shall become tedious, but I must relate to you the most important, the most romantic incident of my life. Why were you not there, my friend? Why were you not there? For 3 months my heart has been a prey to emotions equally sweet and sorrowful, and I was alone. I was alone. Sympathize with me, you who know the sensibility of my heart, you who have seen my eyes filled with tears at the simple recital of a noble or generous action, at the simple sight of a splendid sunset, of the sky studded with bright stars. Do you recollect last year, on our excursion to the ruins of Oppenfeld, on the shore of the vast lake, our reveries during that evening, so full of calm, of poesy, and of peace? Strange contrast! It was 3 days before that bloody duel, in which I would not accept you for my second, for I should have suffered too much for you had I been wounded before your eyes, the duel in which, for a dispute at play, my second unhappily killed the young Frenchman, the Comte de Saint-Remy. Apropos, do you know what has become of the dangerous siren whom M. de Saint-Remy brought with him to Oppenfeld, and whose name was, I think, Cecily David? You will doubtless, my friend, smile with pity at seeing me thus losing myself amongst idle recollections of the past, instead of coming at once to the grave disclosures that I have announced my intention of making. But, in spite of myself, I delay the time from moment to moment. I know how severe you are, and I am fearful of being blamed. Yes, blamed. Because, instead of acting with reflection and prudence of 1 and 20, alas! I have acted foolishly, or rather, I have not acted at all, as I have suffered myself to be carried away by the stream that urged me on, and it is only since my return from Gerolstein that I have been awakened from the enchanting vision that has lulled me to sleep for the last 3 months, and this awakening has been a sorrowful one. Now, my friend, my dear Maximilian, I take courage. Hear me indulgently. I begin with fear and trembling. I dare not look at you, for when you read these lines, how grave and stern will your face become, stoic that you are. After having obtained leave of absence for 6 months, I left Vienna, and remained some time with my father. His health was then good, and he advised me to visit my aunt, the Princess Juliana, superior of the Abbey of Gerolstein. I think I have already told you that my grandfather was cousin german to the present duke's grandfather, and the Duke Gustavus Rodolph, thanks to their relationship, had always treated my father and myself as his cousins. You also know, I think, that during a long stay the prince made recently in France my father was left at the head of the affairs of the duchy. It is not any feeling of ostentatious pride, as you well know, Maximilian, that makes me recapitulate all these circumstances, but to explain to you the causes of the extreme intimacy that existed between the Grand Duke and myself during my stay at Gerolstein. Do you recollect that last year, after our voyage on the banks of the Rhine, we heard that the prince had found and married, in extremis, the Countess Macgregor, in order to legitimize the daughter he had had by her by a previous and secret marriage, afterwards annulled, because it had been contracted against the consent of the late Grand Duke? This young girl thus formally recognized, this charming Princess Amélie, of whom Lord Dudley, who had seen her at Gerolstein about a year ago, spoke to us with an enthusiasm that we suspected of exaggeration. Strange chance! Who would have said then? But although you have doubtless penetrated my secret, let me pursue the progress of events. The convent of St. Hermangeld, of which my aunt is abbess, is scarcely a quarter of a league from Gerolstein, for the gardens of the abbey touch the outskirts of the town. A charming house, perfectly isolated from the cloisters, had been placed at my disposal by my aunt, who has, as you know, the affection of a mother for me. The day of my arrival, she informed me a grand drawing-room would be held the next day, as the Grand Duke was going formally to announce his intended marriage with la Marquise d'Harville, who had just arrived at Gerolstein with her father, the Comte d'Orbigny. The Duke was blamed by some for not having sought an alliance with some royal house, but others, and amongst them my aunt, congratulated him on having chosen, instead of the marriage of ambition, a young and lovely woman to whom he was deeply attached, and who belonged to one of the first families in France. You know, too, that my aunt has always had the greatest regard for the Grand Duke, and has always appreciated his fine qualities. My dear child, said she to me, speaking of the drawing-room, to which I was going the next day, my dear child, the most astonishing sight you will see to-morrow will be the Pearl of Gerolstein. Of whom are you talking, my dear aunt? Of the Princess Amelie, the Grand Duke's daughter. Lord Dudley spoke of her at Vienna with warmth we suspected of exaggeration. At my age and in my position, replied my aunt, people do not exaggerate, so you can trust to my judgment, and I assure you I never knew any one more enchanting than the Princess Amelie. I would speak of her beauty were it not for an indefinable charm she possesses, superior even to her beauty. From the first day that the Grand Duke presented me to her, I felt myself irresistibly drawn towards her, and I am not the only person. The Archduchess Sophia is at Gerolstein, and is the most proud and haughty princess I know. Very true, aunt. Her irony is terrible. Very few persons escape from her sarcasms. At Vienna every one dreaded her. Can the Princess Amelie have found favour in her eyes? The other day she came here after visiting the asylum placed under the princess's direction. Do you know, said this redoubtable Archduchess to me, that if I resided long with the Grand Duke's daughter, I should become quite harmless, so contagious is her goodness. Why, my cousin must be an enchantress, said I, laughing to my aunt. Her most powerful charm, at least in my eyes, replied my aunt, is the mixture of sweetness, modesty, and dignity that I have told you of, and which gives a most touching expression to her face. Indeed, aunt, modesty is a rare quality in a princess so young, so beautiful, and so happy. Reflect that the princess is still more deserving of praise for her modesty, as her elevation is so very recent. In her interview with you, aunt, did the princess make any reference to her early life? No, but when, notwithstanding my advanced age, I addressed her with the respect due to her rank, since her royal highness is the Grand Duke's daughter, her ingenuous confusion, mingled with gratitude and veneration for me, quite overpowered me. For her reserve, full of dignity and affability, proved to me that her present elevation did not make her forget her past life, and that she accorded to my age what I accorded to her rank. It must require, said I, the most perfect tact to observe those nice differences. My dear boy, the more I see of the princess, the more I congratulate myself on my first impression. Since she has been here the number of charitable acts she has done is incredible, and that with a reflection and a judgment that in a person of her age quite surprises me. Judge yourself. At her request, the Grand Duke has founded at Gerolstein an establishment for orphans of 5 or 6 years, and for young girls, who are either orphans or abandoned by their parents, of the age of 16, that age so fatal to those who are not protected against the temptations of vice or the pressure of want. The good sisters of my convent teach and direct the children of this asylum. During my visits there I have had ample opportunities of judging of the adoration of these poor, unfortunate creatures have for the princess. Every day she spends several hours at this place, which is placed under her protection, and I repeat that it is not merely gratitude and respect that the children and nuns feel towards the princess, it almost amounts to fanaticism. The princess must be an angel, said I to my aunt. An angel, indeed, replied she, for you cannot conceive with what touching kindness she treats her young protégés. I have never seen the susceptibility of misfortune meet with more delicate sympathy. You would think some irresistible attraction drew the princess towards this class of unfortunates. Will you believe it? She, the daughter of a sovereign, only addresses these poor children as my sisters. At these last words of my aunt, I confess I felt my eyes fill with tears. Do you not also admire the admirable and pious conduct of this young princess? Since the princess, said I, is so marvellously gifted, I shall be greatly embarrassed when I am presented to her to-morrow. You know how timid I am. You know also that elevation of character imposes upon me more than high birth, so that I am certain to appear both stupid and embarrassed to-morrow, so I make up my mind to that beforehand." "Come, come," said my aunt, smiling, "she will take pity upon you, the more readily as you are not quite a stranger to her." "I am not a stranger to her, aunt." "Certainly not." "How so?" "You recollect that when at the age of 16 you left Oldenzaal, to travel with your father through Russia and England, I had your portrait painted in the costume you wore at the first bal costumé the late Duchess gave?" "Yes, aunt, the costume of a German page of the 16th century. Our famous painter, Fritz Macher, whilst he painted a faithful likeness of you, not only produced a page of that century, but even the style of the pictures of that time. Some days after her arrival at Gerolstein, the Princess Amélie, who had come with her father to visit me, remarked your portrait, and asked what was that charming picture of olden times. Her father smiled and said, 'This is the portrait of a cousin of ours, who would be, were he now alive, as you see by his dress, some 300 years old, but who, although very young, made himself remarkable for his courage and goodness of heart. Has he not bravery in his eyes and goodness in his smile?' Do not, I entreat you, Maximilian, shrug your shoulders with disdain at seeing me write these puerile details of myself, which are, alas, necessary to my story. The Princess Amélie," continued my aunt, "deceived by this innocent pleasantry, after a long examination of your portrait, joined with her father in praising the amiable and determined expression of your face. Some time after, when I went to Gerolstein, she questioned me playfully about her cousin of the olden time. I then explained the trick to her, and told her that the handsome page of the 16th century was really the Prince Henry d'Herkhausen Oldenzaal, a young man of 21, captain in the guards of His Majesty the Emperor of Austria, and in every other respect then the costume very like his picture. At these words the princess," continued my aunt, "blushed and became serious, and has never since spoken of the picture. However, you see that you are not quite a stranger to your cousin. So take courage, and maintain the reputation of your portrait." This conversation took place, as I have already told you, the evening previous to the day on which I was to be presented to the princess my cousin. I left my aunt, and returned to my own apartments. You have often told me, my dear Maximilian, that I was totally free from vanity. I must therefore trust to that to prevent my appearing vain during this recital. As soon as I was alone, I reflected with a secret satisfaction that the Princess Amélie, after seeing my portrait painted 5 or 6 years ago, had inquired after her cousin of the olden time. Nothing could be more absurd than to build the slightest hope on so trivial a circumstance, I acknowledge. But I always treat you with the most perfect confidence, and I acknowledge that this trifling circumstance delighted me. No doubt the praise I had just heard bestowed on the princess by so grave and austere a person as my aunt, by raising her in my estimation, rendered this circumstance more agreeable. Why should I tell you? The hopes I conceived from this trifling event were so mad that, now that I look back more calmly on the past, I ask myself how I could have indulged in ideas that must have ended in my destruction. Although related to the Grand Duke, and always treated by him with the greatest kindness, yet it was impossible to entertain the slightest hope of a marriage with the princess. Even had she returned my affection, it would still have been impossible. Our family holds an honourable position, but it is poor when compared with the Grand Duke, the richest prince of the German Confederation. And besides, I was only 21, a simple captain in the Guards, without any reputation or any position. Never could the Grand Duke think of me as a suitor for his daughter. All these reflections ought to have saved me from a passion I did not as yet feel, but of which I had a strange presentiment. Alas! I rather gave way to fresh puerilities. I wore on my finger a ring that Thekla, the countess of whom I have so often spoken, had given me, although this souvenir of a boyish love could not have much embarrassed me. I sacrificed it to my new flame, and, opening the window, I cast the ring into the waves of the river that flowed beneath. I have no need to tell you what a night I passed. You can imagine. I knew the princess was very beautiful. I sought to picture to myself her features, her air, her manner, her figure, the sound of her voice. And thinking of my portrait, which she had noticed, I recollected that the artist had flattered me excessively, and I contrasted the picturesque dress of a page of the 16th century with the simple uniform of a captain of the Austrian Guards. But amidst all these absurd ideas some generous thoughts crossed my mind, and I was overcome. Yes, overcome by the recollection of the tenderness of the princess for those poor girls whom she always terms my sisters. The next day the hour for the reception came. I tried on several uniforms, one after another, found them all to fit me very ill, and departed very dissatisfied with myself. Although Gerolstein is only a quarter of a league from St. Ermengeld, during the short journey all the childish ideas that had so occupied me during the night had given place to one sad and grave thought. An invincible presentiment told me I was approaching one of the crises of my life. A magical inspiration revealed to me that I was about to love as a man loves but once in his life. And as if to complete my misfortunes, this love, as loftily as deservedly bestowed, was doomed to be unhappy. You do not know the grand ducal palace of Gerolstein. In the opinion of everyone who has visited the capitals of Europe, there is, with the exception of Versailles, no royal residence that has a more regal and imposing appearance. If at this time I speak of this, it is because, thinking over them, I wonder how they did not recall me to myself. For the Princess Amélie was the daughter of the sovereign of this palace, these guards, and of these riches. You arrived at the palace by the Marble Court, so called because, with the exception of a drive for the carriages, it is paved with variegated marble, forming the most magnificent mosaics, in the centre of which is a basin of breccia antique, into which a stream of water flows from a porphyry vase. This court of honor is surrounded by a row of beautiful marble statues, holding candelabras of gilt bronze, from which sprung brilliant jets of gas. Alternately with these statues are the Medicean vases, raised on richly sculptured pedestals, and filled with rose laurels, whose leaves shine in the lights with a metallic lustre. The carriages stopped at the foot of the double staircase leading to the peristyle of the palace. At the foot of this staircase were stationed on guard, mounted on their black horses, 2 soldiers of the regiment of the guards of the Grand Duke. You would have been struck with the stern and warlike appearance of these 2 giants, whose cuirasses and helmets, made like those of the ancients, without crest or plume, sparkled in the sun. These soldiers wore blue coats with yellow collars, buckskin breeches, and jack boots. To please you who are so fond of military details, I add, that at the top landing of the staircase were stationed, as sentinels, 2 grenadiers of the foot guards of the duke. Their uniform, with the exception of the colour of the coat and facings, resembles, I am told, that of Napoleon's grenadiers. After traversing the vestibule, where the porters of the duke were stationed, halberd in hand, I ascended a splendid staircase of white marble, which opened upon a portico, ornamented with jasper columns, and surmounted by a painted and gilt cupola. There were 2 long files of domestics. I then entered the guard-room, at the door of which I found a chamberlain and an aide-de-camp, whose duty it was to present to His Royal Highness those persons who were entitled to this honour. My relationship, though distant, procured me a special presentation. An aide-de-camp preceded me into a long gallery, filled with gentlemen in full court dress or uniform, and splendidly attired ladies. Whilst I passed through this brilliant assembly, I heard here and there remarks that augmented my embarrassment. Every one admired the angelic beauty of the Princess Amélie, the charming appearance of the Marquise d'Harville, and the imperial air of the Archduchess Sophia, who recently arrived from Munich with the Archduke Stanislaus, was about to depart for Warsaw. But, whilst rendering their just tribute of admiration to the lofty bearing of the Duchess and to the charms of the Marquise d'Harville, every one agreed that nothing could exceed the loveliness of the Princess Amélie. As I approached the spot where the Grand Duke and the Princess were, I felt my heart beat more and more violently. At the moment that I entered the salon, I forgot to tell you there was a concert and ball at court. The famous Liszt sat down to the piano, and instantly the most profound silence succeeded the conversation that was going on. I waited in the embrasure of a door until Liszt had finished the piece he was playing with his accustomed taste. It was then that I saw the Princess Amélie for the first time. I must tell you all that passed, for I feel an indescribable pleasure in writing it. Picture to yourself a large salon furnished with regal splendor, brilliantly lighted up, and hung with crimson silk, embroidered with wreaths of flowers and gold. In the first row, on large gilt chairs, sat the Archduchess Sophia with Madame d'Harville on her left, and the Princess Amélie on her right. Behind them stood the Duke in the uniform of Colonel of the Guards. He seemed scarcely 30, and the military uniform set off his fine figure and noble features. Beside him was the Archduke Stanislaus in the uniform of a field marshal. Then came the princess's maids of honor, the ladies of the grand dignitaries of the court, and then the dignitaries themselves. I need scarcely tell you that the Princess Amélie was less conspicuous by her rank than by her extraordinary beauty. Do not condemn me without reading this description of her. Although it falls far short of the reality, you will understand my adoration. You will understand that as soon as I saw her I loved her, and that the suddenness of my passion can only be equalled by its violence and its eternity. The Princess Amélie was dressed in a plain white watered silk dress, and wore, like the Archduchess, the riband of the Imperial Order of St. Nepomucenus, recently sent to her by the Empress. A diadem of pearls surrounded her head, and harmonized admirably with two splendid braids of fair hair that shaded her delicate cheeks. Her arms, whiter than the lace that ornamented them, were half hidden in long gloves, reaching nearly to her elbow. Nothing could be more perfect than her figure, nothing more charming than her foot in its satin slipper. At the moment when I saw her, her beaming blue eyes wore a pensive expression. I do not know whether some serious thought came over her, or whether she was impressed with the grave melody of the piece Liszt was playing, but the expression of her countenance seemed to me full of sweetness and melancholy. Never can I express my feelings at that moment. All that my aunt had related of her goodness crossed my mind. Smile if you will, but my eyes became full of tears when I saw this young girl, so beautiful and so idolized by such a father, seem so melancholy and pensive. You know how scrupulously etiquette and the privileges of rank are observed by us. Thanks to my title and my relationship to the Grand Duke, the crowd in the midst of which I stood gradually fell back, and I found myself left almost alone in the embrasure of the door. It was, no doubt, owing to this circumstance that the princess, awaking from her reverie, perceived, and no doubt recognized me, for she started and blushed. She had seen my portrait at my aunt's, and recognized me. Nothing could be more simple. The princess's eyes did not rest upon me an instant, but that look threw me into the most violent confusion. I felt my cheeks glow, I cast down my eyes, and did not venture to raise them for some time. When I dared at last to steal a glance at the princess, she was speaking in a low tone to the Archduchess, who seemed to listen to her with the most affectionate interest. Liszt having paused for a few moments between the pieces he was playing, the Grand Duke took the opportunity of expressing his admiration. On returning to his place he perceived me, nodded kindly to me, and said something to the Archduchess, fixing his eyes on me at the same time. The Duchess, after looking at me a moment, turned to the Duke, who smiled and said something to his daughter that seemed to embarrass her, for she blushed again. I was on thorns. But unfortunately etiquette forbade my leaving my place until the concert was over. As soon as the concert was finished, I followed the aide-de-camp. He conducted me to the Grand Duke, who deigned to advance a few steps towards me, took me by the arm, and said to the Archduchess Sophia, "Permit me to present to your Royal Highness my cousin, Prince Henry of Herkosen-Oldenzaal." "I have seen the prince at Vienna, and meet him here with pleasure," replied the Duchess, before whom I inclined myself respectfully. "My dear Amélie," continued the prince, addressing his daughter, "this is Prince Henry, your cousin, the son of one of my most valued friends, Prince Paul, whom I greatly lament not seeing here to-day." Pray, monseigneur, inform the prince that I equally regret his absence, for I am always delighted to know any of my father's friends." I had not until then heard the princess's voice, and I was struck with its intense sweetness. "I hope, my dear Henry, you will stay some time with your aunt," said the Grand Duke. "Come and see us often about 3 o'clock en famille, and if we ride out you must accompany us. You know how great an affection I have always felt for you, for your noble qualities. I cannot express my gratitude for your royal highness's kindness." "Well, to prove it," said the Grand Duke, smiling, "engage your cousin for the second quadrille. The first belongs to the Archduke." "Will your royal highness do me the honour?" said I to my cousin. "Oh, call each other cousin, as in the good old times," replied the duke, laughing. "There should be no ceremony between relations." "Will you dance with me, cousin?" "Yes, cousin," replied the princess. I cannot tell how much I felt the touching kindness of the Grand Duke, and how bitterly I reproached myself for yielding to an affection the prince would never authorize. I vowed inwardly that nothing should induce me to acquaint my cousin with my affection, but I feared my emotion would betray me. I had leisure for these reflections whilst my cousin danced the first quadrille with the Archduke Stanislaus. Nothing was more suited to display the graces of the princess's person than the slow movements of the dance. I anxiously awaited my turn, and I succeeded in concealing my emotion when I led her to the quadrille. "Does your royal highness sanction my calling you cousin?" said I. "Oh, yes, cousin. I am always delighted to obey my father." "I rejoice in this familiarity, since I have learnt from my aunt to know you." "My father has often spoken of you, cousin, and what may, perhaps, astonish you," added she, timidly, "I also knew you by sight. For one day the abbess of St. Ermengarde, your aunt, for whom I have the greatest respect, showed me your picture." "As a page of the 16th century?" "Yes, cousin, and my father was malicious enough to tell me that it was an ancestor of ours, and spoke so highly of his courage and his other qualities that our family ought to be proud of their descent from him." "Alas, cousin, I fear my resemblance to my portrait is not great." "You are mistaken, cousin," said the princess, "for at the end of the concert I recognized you immediately, in spite of the difference of costume." Then, wishing to change the conversation, she added, "How charmingly Monsieur Litz plays, does he not?" "Yes. How attentively you listen to him!" "Because there is to me a double charm in music without words. Not only you hear the execution, but you can adapt your thoughts to the melody. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly. Your own thoughts become words to the air." "Yes, you quite comprehend me," said she, with a gesture of satisfaction. "I feared I could not express what I felt just now." "I thank God, cousin," said I, smiling, "you can have no words to set to so sad an air." I know not whether my question was indiscreet or whether she had not heard me, but suddenly she exclaimed, pointing out to me the Grand Duke, who crossed the room with the Archduchess on his arm, "Cousin, look at my father, how handsome he is! How noble! How good! Every one looks at him as if they loved him more than they feared him." "Ah!" cried I, "it is not only here he is beloved. If the blessing of his people be transmitted to their posterity, the name of Rodolph of Gerolstein will be immortal." "To speak thus is to be, indeed, worthy of his attachment." "I do but give utterance to the feelings of all present. See how they all hasten to pay their respects to Madame d'Harville." "No one in the world is more worthy of my father's affections than Madame d'Harville." "You are more capable than any one of appreciating her, as you have been in France." Scarcely had I pronounced these words than the princess cast down her eyes, and her features assumed an air of melancholy. And when I led her back to her seat the expression of them was still the same. I suppose that my allusion to her stay in France recalled the death of her mother. In the course of the evening a circumstance occurred which you may think too trivial to mention perhaps, but which evinces the extraordinary influence this young girl universally inspires. Her bandeau of pearls having become disarranged, the Archduchess Sophia, who was leaning on her arm, kindly readjusted the ornament upon her brow. Knowing, as we do, the hauteur of the Archduchess, Such condescension is almost inconceivable." The next morning I was invited, together with a few other persons, to be present at the marriage of the Grand Duke with Madame la Marquise d'Harville. I had never seen the princess so radiant and happy. Some days after the duke's marriage I had a long interview with him. He questioned me about my past life, my future career. He gave me the most admirable advice, the kindest encouragement. So much so that the idea crossed my mind that he had perceived my love and wished to bring me to confess it. But this idea was soon dispelled. The prince concluded by telling me that the great wars were over, that I ought to avail myself of my name, my connections, the education I had received, and my father's friendship with the Prince de M., Prime Minister of the Emperor, in order to follow a diplomatic instead of a military career. In a word, he offered me his sovereign protection to facilitate my entry in the career he proposed to me. I thanked him for his offers with gratitude, and added that I felt the weight of his advice and would follow it. I at first visited the palace very seldom, but, thanks to the duke's reiterated invitations, I was soon there almost every day. We lived in the peaceful retirement resembling that of some English mansions. When the weather permitted, we rode out with the duke, the duchess, and the grand personages of the court. When we were forced to remain at home, we sang, and I accompanied the grand duchess and my cousin, who had the sweetest and most expressive voice I ever heard. At other times we inspected the magnificent picture galleries and museums, and the library of the prince, who is one of the most accomplished men in Europe. I often dined at the palace, and on the opera nights I accompanied the duke's family to the theatre. Could this intimacy have lasted for ever I should have been very happy, perhaps, but I reflected that I should be summoned to Vienna by my duties. I reflected also that the duke would soon think of finding a suitable alliance for his daughter. My cousin remarked this change in me. The evening before I quitted Gerolstein, she told me she had for several days remarked my abstracted manner. I endeavoured to evade this question, saying that my approaching departure was the cause. "I can scarcely believe it," replied she. "My father treats you like a son, every one loves you. It would be ingratitude if you were unhappy." "Alas!" said I, unable to restrain my emotion, "it is grief I am a prey to." "Why, what has happened?" "Just now, cousin, you have told me your father treated me like a son, and that every one loved me. And yet, ere long, I must quit Gerolstein. It is this that grieves me." "And are the recollections of those you have left as nothing?" "Doubtless; but time brings so many changes." "There are affections, at least, that are unchangeable, such as that of my father for you, such as that I feel for you. When you are once brother and sister, you never forget each other," added she, looking up, her large blue eyes full of tears. I was on the point of betraying myself. However, I controlled my feelings in time. "Do you think, then, cousin," said I, "that when I return in a few years this affection will continue?" "Why should it not?" "Because you will probably be married, you will have other duties to perform, and you will forget your poor brother." This was all that passed. I know not if she was offended at these words, or whether she was like myself grieved at the changes the future must bring. But instead of answering me, she was silent for a moment, then, rising hastily from her seat, her face pale and altered, she left the room, after having looked for a few seconds at the embroidery of the young Countess d'Oppenheim, one of her maids of honour. The same evening I received a second letter from my father, urging me to return. The next morning I took leave of the Grand Duke. He told me my cousin was unwell, but that he would make my adieux. He then embraced me tenderly, renewed his promises of assistance, and added that, whenever I had leave of absence, nothing would give him greater pleasure than to see me at Gerolstein. Happily, on my arrival I found my father better; still confined to his bed, and very weak, it is true, but out of danger. Now that you know all, Maximilian, tell me, what can I do?" Just as I finished this letter, my door opened, and, to my great surprise, my father, whom I believed to be in bed, entered. He saw the letter on the table. "To whom are you writing so long a letter?" said he, smiling. "To Maximilian, father." "Oh, said he, with an expression of affectionate reproach. "He has all your confidence. He is very happy." He pronounced these last words in so sorrowful a tone that I held out the letter to him, almost without reflection, saying, "Read it, father." My friend, he has read all. After having remained musing some time, he said to me, "Henry, I shall write and inform the Grand Duke of all that passed during your stay at Gerolstein." "Father, I entreat you not." "Is what you have written to Maximilian scrupulously true?" "Yes." "Do you love your cousin?" "I adore her, but—" My father interrupted me. "Then in that case, I shall write to the Grand Duke and demand her hand for you." "But, father, such a demand will be madness on my part." "It is true, but still in making this demand I shall acquaint the prince with my reasons for making it. He has received you with the greatest kindness, and it would be unworthy of me to deceive him. He will be touched at the frankness of my demand, and though he refuse it, as he certainly will, he will yet know that, should you ever again visit Gerolstein, you cannot be on the same familiar terms with the princess. You know that, although so tenderly attached to me, my father is inflexible in whatever concerns his duty. Judge, then, of my fears, of my anxiety. I hastily terminate this long letter, but I will soon write again. Sympathize with me, for I fear I shall go mad if the fever that preys on me does not soon abate. Adieu, adieu. Ever yours, Henry Dho. We will now conduct the reader to the palace of Gerolstein, inhabited by Fleur de Marie since her return from France. End of Epilogue Chapter 1. Read by Céline Major. Epilogue Chapter 2 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Princess Amélie, Part 1. The apartment of Fleur de Marie, we only call her the Princess Amélie officially, had been, by Rodolph's orders, splendidly furnished. From the balcony of the oratory the 2 towers of the convent of St. Hermangeld were visible, which, embosomed in the woods, were in their turn overtopped by a high hill, at the foot of which the abbey was built. One fine summer's morning Fleur de Marie gazed listlessly at this splendid landscape. Her hair was plainly braided, and she wore a high white dress with blue stripes. A large muslin collar was fastened around her throat by a small blue silk handkerchief, of the same hue as her sash. Seated in a large armchair of carved ebony, she leant her head on her small and delicately white hand. Fleur de Marie's attitude and expression of her face showed that she was a prey to the deepest melancholy. At this instant, a female of a grave and distinguished appearance entered the room, and coughed gently to attract Fleur de Marie's attention. She started from her reverie, and, gracefully acknowledging the salutation of the newcomer, said, "What is it, my dear countess?" "I come to inform you, your royal highness, that the Grand Duke will be here in a few minutes, and also to ask a favour of you." "Ask it. You know how happy I am to oblige you." "It concerns an unhappy creature who had unfortunately quitted Gerolstein before your royal highness had founded the asylum for orphans and children abandoned by their parents." "What do you wish I should do for her?" "The father went to seek his fortune in America, leaving his wife and daughter to gain a precarious subsistence. The mother died, and this poor girl, then only 16, was seduced and abandoned. She fell lower and lower, until at length she became, like so many others, the opprobrium of her sex." Fleur de Marie turned red and shuddered. The countess, fearing she had wounded the delicacy of the princess by the mention of this girl's condition, replied, "I pray your royal highness to pardon me. I have, doubtless, shocked you by speaking of this wretched creature, but her repentance seemed so sincere that I ventured to plead for her." "You were quite right. Pray continue," said Fleur de Marie, subduing her emotion. "Every fault is worthy of pity when followed by repentance." "After 2 years passed in this wretched mode of existence, she repented sincerely and came back to Gerolstein. She chanced to lodge in the house of a good and pious widow. Encouraged by her kindness, the poor creature told her all her sad story, adding that she bitterly regretted the faults of her early life, and that all she desired was to enter some religious house, where by prayer and penitence she might atone for her sins. She is only 18, very beautiful, and possesses a considerable sum of money, which she wishes to bestow on the convent she enters. I undertake to provide for her, said Fleur de Marie. Since she repents, she is worthy of compassion. Her remorse must be more bitter in proportion as it is sincere. I hear the Grand Duke, said the lady in waiting, without remarking Fleur de Marie's agitation. And as she spoke, Rodolph entered, holding a large bouquet of roses in his hand. At the sight of the prince the countess retired, and scarcely had she left the apartment, than Fleur de Marie threw herself into her father's arms, and leant her head on his shoulder. Good morning, love, said Rodolph, pressing her to his heart. See what beautiful roses! I never saw finer ones. And the prince made a slight motion, as if to disengage himself from her and look at her, when, seeing her weeping, he threw down the bouquet, and taking her hands, cried, You are weeping! What is the matter? Nothing, dear father, said Fleur de Marie, striving to smile. My child, replied Rodolph, you are concealing something from me. Tell me, I entreat you, what thus distresses you? Never mind the bouquet. Oh, you know how fond I am of roses. I always was. Do you recollect, added she, my poor little rose tree? I have preserved the pieces of it so carefully. At this terrible allusion, Rodolph cried, Unhappy child! Is it possible that in the midst of all the splendour that surrounds you, you think of the past? Alas! I hoped my tenderness had made you forget it. Forgive me, dear father. I did not mean what I said. I grieve you. I grieve, my child, because I know how painful it is for you thus to ponder over the past. Dear father, it is the first time since I have been here. The first time you have mentioned it, but not the first time you have thought of it. I have for a long time noticed your sadness, and was unable to account for it. My position was so delicate, though I never told you anything, I thought of you constantly. When I contracted my marriage, I thought it would increase your happiness. I did not venture to hope you would quite forget the past, but I hoped that, cherished and supported by the amiable woman whom I had chosen for my wife, you would look upon the past as amply atoned for by your sufferings. No matter what faults you had committed, they have been 1,000 times expiated by the good you have done since you have been here. Father! Oh, let me tell you all, since a providential chance has brought about this conversation I at once desired and dreaded. I would, to secure your happiness, have sacrificed my affection for Madame d'Harville and my friendship for Murphy, had I thought they recalled the past to you. Oh, their presence, when they know what I was, and yet love me so tenderly, seems a proof of pardon and oblivion to me. I should have been miserable if for my sake you had renounced Madame d'Harville's hand. Oh, you know not what sacrifice Clémence herself would have made, for she was aware of the full extent of my duties to you. Duties to me? What have I done to deserve so much goodness? Until the moment that Heaven restored you to me, your life had been one of sorrow and misery, and I reproach myself with your sufferings as if I had caused them, and when I see you happy, it seems to me I am forgiven. My only wish, my sole aim, is to render you as happy as you were before unhappy, to exalt you as you have been abased, for the last trace of your humiliation must disappear when you see the noblest in the land vie with each other who shall show you most respect. Respect to me? Oh, no! It is to my rank and not to myself they show respect. It is to you, dear child, it is to you. You love me so much, dear father, that every one thinks to please you by showing me respect. Oh, naughty child! cried Rodolph, tenderly kissing his daughter. She will not cede anything to my paternal pride. Is not your pride satisfied at my attributing the kindness I received to you only? No, that is not the same thing. I cannot be proud of myself, but of you. You are ignorant of your own merits. In 15 months your education has been so perfected that the most enthusiastic mother would be proud of you. At this moment the door of the salon opened, and Clémence, Grand Duchess of Gerolstein, entered, holding a letter in her hand. Here, love, is a letter from France, said she to Rodolph. I brought it myself, because I wished to bid good morrow to my dear child, whom I have not yet seen to-day. This letter arrives most opportunely, said Rodolph. We were speaking of the past. That monster we must destroy, since he threatens the repose of our child. Is it possible that these fits of melancholy we have so often remarked were occasioned by unhappy recollections, but now that we know the enemy, we shall destroy him." "From whom is this letter?" asked Clémence. "From Rigolette, Germain's wife." "Rigolette!" cried Fleur de Marie. "Oh, I am so glad!" "Do you not fear that this letter may serve to awaken fresh recollections?" said Clémence, in a low tone to Rodolph. "On the contrary, I wish to destroy these recollections, and I shall doubtless find arms in this letter, for Rigolette is a worthy creature, who appreciated and adored our child." Rodolph then read the following letter aloud: "Bouqueval Farm, August 15th, 1841. "Monseigneur, I take the liberty of writing to you to communicate a great happiness which has occurred to us, and to ask of you another favour. Of you, to whom we already owe so much, or rather to whom we owe the real paradise in which we live, myself, my dear Germain, and his good mother. It is this, monseigneur: for the last 10 days I have been crazy with joy, for 10 days ago I was confined with such a love of a little girl, which I say is the image of Germain, he says it is exactly like me, and our dear mother says it is like us both. The fact is, it has beautiful blue eyes like Germain, and black curly hair like mine." "Good worthy people, they deserve to be happy," said Rodolph. "If ever there was a couple well matched, it is they." "But really, monseigneur, I must ask your pardon for this chatter. Your ears must often tingle, monseigneur, for the day never passes that we do not talk of you, when we say to each other how happy we are, how happy we were, for then your name naturally occurs. Excuse this blot, monseigneur, but without thinking of it, I had written Monsieur Rodolph, as I used to say formerly, and then I scratched it out. I hope you will find my writing improved as well as my spelling, for Germain gives me lessons, and I do not make those long ugly scrawls I used to do when you mended my pens." "I must confess," said Rodolph, with a smile, "that my little protégé makes a mistake, and I am sure Germain is more frequently employed in kissing the hand of his scholar than in directing it." "My dear duke, you are unjust," said Clémence, looking at the letter. "It is rather a very large hand, but very legible." "Why, yes, she really has improved," observed Rodolph. "It would in former days have taken 8 pages to contain what she now writes in 2." And he continued: "It is quite true, you know, monseigneur, that you used to mend my pens, and when we think of it, we 2 Germains, we feel quite ashamed when we recollect how free from pride you were. Ah, I am again chattering instead of saying what we wish to ask of you, monseigneur; for my husband unites with me, and it is very important, for we attach a great deal to it, as you will see. We entreat of you, monseigneur, to have the goodness to choose for us and give us a name for our dear little daughter. This has been the wish of the godfather and godmother, and who do you think they are, monseigneur? 2 persons whom you and the Marquise d'Harville have taken from misery and made very happy as we are. They are Morel the lapidary, and Jeanne Duport, a worthy creature whom I met in prison when I went there to visit my dear Germain, and whom the marquise afterwards took out of the hospital. And now, monseigneur, you must know why we have chosen M. Morel for godfather and Jeanne Duport for godmother. We said it would be the one way of again thanking M. Rodolph for all his kindness, to have, as godfather and godmother for our little one, worthy persons who owe everything to him and the marchioness; whilst at the same time Morel and Jeanne Duport are the worthiest people breathing. They are of our own class in life, and besides, as we say with Germain, they are our kinsfolk in happiness, for, like us, they are of the family of your protégés." "Really, my dear father, this idea is most delightful and excellent," said Fleur de Marie, "to take for godfather and godmother persons who owe everything to you and my dear second mother." "Yes, indeed, dearest," said Clémence, "and I am deeply touched at their remembrance." "And I am very happy to find that my favours have been so well bestowed," said Rodolph, continuing his letter. "With the money you gave him, Morel has now become a jewel broker, and earns enough to bring up his family very respectably. Poor Louise, who is a very good girl, is going, I believe, to be married to a very worthy young man, who loves and respects her as he ought to do, for she has been unfortunate, but not guilty, and Louise's husband, that is to be, is perfectly sensible of this." Rodolph laid great stress on these last words, looked at his daughter for a moment, and then continued: "I must add, monseigneur, that Jeanne Duport, through the generosity of the marquise, has been separated from her husband, that bad man who beat her and took everything from her. She has now her eldest daughter with her. They keep a small trimming shop and are doing very well. Germain writes to you regularly, Monseigneur, every month, on the subject of the Bank for Mechanics out of work and gratuitous loans. There are scarcely any sums in arrear, and we find already the good effects of it in this quarter. 9, at least, poor families can support themselves in the dead season of work without sending their clothes and bedding to the pawnbrokers. And when work comes in, it does one's heart good to see the haste with which they return the money lent, and they bless you for the loans so serviceably advanced. Yes, Monseigneur, they bless you, for although you say you did nothing in this but appoint Germain, and that an unknown did this great benefit, we must always suppose it was you who founded it, as it appears to us the most natural idea. There is, besides, a most famous trumpet to repeat that it is you who are the real benefactor. This trumpet is Madame Pipelet, who repeats to every one that it could be no one but her king of lodgers, excuse her, M. Rodolph, but she always calls you so, who established such a charitable institution, and her old darling Alfred is of the same opinion. He is so proud and contented with his post as porter to the bank that he says all the tricks of M. Cabrion would not have the slightest effect on him now. Germain has read in the newspapers that Martial, a colonist of Algeria, has been mentioned with great praise for the courage he had shown in repulsing, at the head of the settlers, an attack of plundering Arabs, and that his wife, as intrepid as himself, had been slightly wounded by his side, where she handled her musket like a real grenadier. Since this time, says the newspaper, she has been called Madame Carabine. Excuse this long letter, Monseigneur, but I think you will not be displeased to hear from us news of all those whose benefactor you have been. I write to you from the farm at Bouqueval, where we have been since the spring with our good mother. Germain leaves us in the morning for his business, and returns in the evening. In the autumn we shall return to Paris. It is so strange, M. Rodolph, that I, who could never endure the country, am now so fond of it. I suppose it is because Germain likes it so very much. As to the farm, M. Rodolph, you who know, no doubt, where the good little Goualeuse is, will perhaps tell her that we very often think of her as one of the dearest and gentlest creatures in the world, and that, for myself, I never think of my own happy condition without saying to myself, since M. Rodolph was also the M. Rodolph of dear Fleur de Marie, that, no doubt, she is by his kindness as happy as we are, and that makes one feel still more happy. Ah, how I chatter! What will you say to all this? But you are so good, and then, you know, it is your fault if I go on as long and as merrily as Papa Crétu and Ramonette, who no longer have a chance with me in singing. You will not refuse our request, will you, Monseigneur? If you will give a name to our dear little child, it will seem to us that it will bring her good fortune, like a lucky star. If I conclude by saying to you, M. Rodolph, that we try to give every assistance in our power to the poor, it is not to boast, but that you may know that we do not keep to ourselves all the happiness you have given to us. Besides, we always say to those we succour, it is not us whom you should thank and bless, it is M. Rodolph, the best, most generous person in the world. Adieu, Monseigneur, and pray believe that when our dear little child begins to lisp, the first word she shall utter will be your name, M. Rodolph, and the next those you wrote on the basket which contained your generous wedding presents to me. Labour and discretion, honour and happiness. Thanks to these 4 words, our love and our care, we hope, Monseigneur, that our child will be always worthy to pronounce the name of him who has been our benefactor, and that of all the unfortunates he ever knew. Forgive me, Monseigneur, but I cannot finish without the big tears in my eyes, but they are tears of happiness. Excuse all errors, if you please. It is not my fault, but I cannot see very clearly, and I scribble. I have the honour to be, Monseigneur, your respectful and most grateful servant, Rigolette Germain. P.S. Ah, Monseigneur, in reading my letter over again, I see I have often written M. Rodolph, but you will excuse me, for you know, Monseigneur, that under any and every name we respect and bless you alike. Dear little Rigolette, said Clémence, affected by the letter, how full of good and right feeling is her letter! It is, indeed, replied Rodolph. She has an admirable disposition, her heart is all that is good, and our dear daughter appreciates her as we do, he added, addressing Fleur de Marie, when, struck by her pale countenance, he exclaimed, But what ails you, dearest? Alas, what a painful contrast between my position and that of Rigolette! Labour and discretion, honour and happiness, these 4 words declare all that my life has been, all that it ought to have been. A young, industrious, and discreet girl, a beloved wife, a happy mother, an honoured woman, such is her destiny, whilst I—
What do you say?
Forgive me, my dear father, do not accuse me of ingratitude; but in spite of your unspeakable tenderness and that of my second mother, in spite of the splendour with which I am surrounded, in spite of your sovereign power, my shame is incurable. Nothing can destroy the past. Forgive me, dear father. Until now I have concealed this from you, but the recollection of my original degradation drives me to despair, kills me."
"Clémence, do you hear?" cried Rodolph, in extreme distress. "Oh, fatality, fatality! Now I curse my fears, my silence. This sad idea, so long and deeply rooted in her mind, has, unknown to us, made fearful ravages. It is too late to contend against this sad error. Oh, I am indeed wretched!"
"Courage, my dearest!" said Clémence to Rodolph. "You said but now that it is best to know the enemy that threatens us. We know now the cause of our child's sorrow, and will triumph over it, because we shall have with us reason, justice, and our excessive love for her."
"And then she will see, too, that her affliction, if it be indeed incurable, will render ours incurable," said Rodolph. After a protracted silence, during which Fleur de Marie appeared to recover herself, she took Rodolph's and Clémence's hands in her own, and said in a voice deeply affected,
"Hear me, beloved father, and you my best of mothers. God has willed it, and I thank him for it, that I should no longer conceal from you all that I feel. I must have done so shortly, and told you what I will now avow, for I could not longer have kept it concealed."
"Ah, now I comprehend!" ejaculated Rodolph, "and there is no longer any hope for her."
"I hope in the future, my dear father, and this hope gives me strength to speak thus to you."
"And what can you hope for the future, poor child, since your present fate only causes you grief and torment?"
"I will tell you, but before I do so let me recall to you the past, and confess before God, who hears me, what I have felt to this time."
"Speak, speak, we listen," was Rodolph's reply.
"As long as I was in Paris with you, my dearest father, I was so happy that such days of bliss cannot be paid for too dearly by years of suffering. You see, I have at least known happiness."
"For some days, perhaps."
"Yes, but what pure and unmingled happiness! The future dazzled me. A father to adore, a second mother to cherish doubly, for she replaced mine, whom I never knew. Then, for I will confess all, my pride was roused in spite of myself. So greatly did I rejoice in belonging to you. If then I sometimes thought vaguely of the past, it was to say to myself, I formerly so debased am the beloved daughter of a sovereign prince, whom everybody blesses and reveres. I, formerly so wretched, now enjoy all the splendours of luxury, and an existence almost royal. Alas! My father, my good fortune was so unlooked for, your power surrounded me with so much brilliancy that I was, perhaps, excusable in allowing myself to be thus blinded."
"Excusable? Nothing could be more natural, my angelic girl. What was there wrong in being proud of a rank which was your own, in enjoying the advantages of a position to which I had restored you? I remember at this time you were so delightfully gay, and said to me in accents I never can again hope to hear, 'Dearest father, this is too much happiness.' Unfortunately, it was these recollections that begat in me this deceitful security." End of Epilogue Chapter 2, Part 1, read by Céline Major. Epilogue Chapter 2, Part 2 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Princess Amélie, Part 2. "Do you remember, my father," said Fleur de Marie, unable to overcome a shudder of horror, "do you remember the terrible scene that preceded our departure from Paris, when your carriage was stopped?" "Yes," answered Rodolph, in a tone of melancholy. "Brave Chourineur! After having once more saved my life, He died there, before our eyes."
"Well, my father, at the moment when that unhappy man expired, do you know whom I saw looking steadfastly at me? Ah, that look! That look! It has haunted me ever since," added Fleur de Marie, with a shudder.
"What look? Of whom do you speak?" cried Rodolph.
"Of the ogress of the tapis franc," answered Fleur de Marie.
"That monster! You saw her? And where?"
"Did you not see her in the tavern where the Chourineur died? She was amongst the women who surrounded us."
"Ah, now," said Rodolph, in a tone of despair, "I understand. Struck with horror as you were at the murder of the Chourineur, you must have imagined that you saw something prophetic in the sinister rencontre."
"Yes, indeed, father, it was so. At the sight of the ogress I felt a death-like shiver, and it seemed that under her scowl my heart, which until then had been light, joyous, bounding, was instantly chilled to ice. Yes, to meet that woman at the very instant when the Chourineur died, saying, 'Heaven is just,' it seemed to me as a rebuke from Providence for my proud forgetfulness of the past, which I was hereafter to expiate by humility and repentance."
"But the past was forced on you, and you are not responsible for that in the sight of God."
"You were driven to it, overcome, my poor child."
"Once precipitated into the abyss in spite of yourself, and unable to quit in spite of your remorse and despair, through the atrocious recklessness of the society of which you were a victim, you saw yourself for ever chained to this den, and it required that chance should throw you in my way to rescue you from such thraldom."
"Then, too, my child, your father says you were the victim and not the accomplice of this infamy," said Clémence. "But yet, my mother, I have known this infamy," replied Fleur de Marie, in a tone of deepest grief. "Nothing can destroy these fearful recollections. They pursue me incessantly, not as formerly, in the midst of the peaceful inhabitants of the farm, or the fallen women who were my companions in St. Lazare, but they pursue me even in this palace, filled with the élite of Germany. They pursue me even to my father's arms, even to the steps of his throne." And Fleur de Marie burst into an agony of tears. Rodolph and Clémence remained silent in presence of this fearful expression of unextinguishable remorse. They wept, too, for they perceived that their consolations were vain. "Since then," continued Fleur de Marie, drying her tears, "I say to myself every moment in the day, with bitter shame, 'I am honoured, revered, and the most eminent and venerated persons surround me with respect and attention. In the eyes of the whole court the sister of an emperor has deigned to fasten my bandeau on my forehead, and I have lived in the mire of the Cité, familiar with thieves and murderers. Forgive me, dearest father, but the more elevated my position, the more deeply sensitive have I been to the deep degradation into which I had fallen; and at every homage paid me I feel myself guilty of profanation, and I think it sacrilege to receive such attentions, knowing what I have been. And then I say to myself, if God should please that the past were all known, with what deserved scorn would she be treated whom they now elevate so high? What a just and fearful punishment! But, poor girl, my wife and I know the past. We are worthy of our rank, and yet we cherish you." "Because you feel for me the tenderness of a father and mother."
"But remember all the good you have done since your residence here, and the excellent and holy institution you have founded for orphans and poor forsaken girls. Then, too, the affection which the worthy abbess of St. Hermangeld evinces towards you, ought not that to be attributed to your unfeigned piety?"
"Whilst the praises of the abbess of St. Hermangeld refer only to my present conduct, I accept it without scruple; but when she cites my example to the noble young ladies who have taken vows in the abbey, I feel as if I were the accomplice of an infamous falsehood."
After a long silence, Rodolph resumed, with deep melancholy: "I see it is unavailing to persuade you. Reasoning is impotent against a conviction the more steadfast as it is derived from a noble and generous feeling. The contrast of your past and present position must be a perpetual punishment. Forgive me for saying so, my beloved one."
"Forgive you? And for what, my dear father?"
"For not having foreseen your excessive susceptibility, which, from the delicacy of your heart, I should have anticipated. And yet, what could I have done? It was my duty solemnly to recognise you as my daughter.
yet I was wrong to be too proud of you. I should have concealed my treasure, and lived in retirement with Clémence and you, instead of raising you high, so high that the past would disappear as I hoped from your eyes." Several knocks were heard at this moment, which interrupted the conversation. Rodolph opened the door, and saw Murphy, who said, "I beg your royal highness's pardon for thus disturbing you, but a courier from the Prince of Herkaüsen Oldenzaal has just arrived with this letter, which he says is very important, and must be delivered immediately to your royal highness." "Thanks, good Murphy, do not go away," said Rodolph with a sigh. "I shall want you presently." And the prince, closing the door, remained a moment in the anteroom to read the letter which Murphy had brought him, and which was as follows: "My Lord, trusting that the bonds of relationship existing between us, as well as the friendship with which you have ever honoured me, will excuse the boldness of the step I am about to take, I will at once enter upon the purport of my letter, dictated as it is by a conscientious desire to act as becomes the man your highness deigns to style his friend. 15 months have now elapsed since you returned from France, bringing with you your long-lost daughter, whom you so happily discovered living with that mother from whom she had never been parted, and whom you espoused when in extremis in order to legitimize the Princess Amelie. Thus ennobled of matchless beauty, and, as I learned from my sister, the Abbess of St. Hermangeld, endowed with a character pure and elevated as the princely race from which she springs, who would not envy your happiness in possessing such a treasure? I will now candidly state the purport of my letter, although I should certainly have been the bearer of the request it contains, were it not that a severe indisposition detains me at Oldenzaal. During the time my son passed at Gerolstein, he had frequent opportunities of seeing the Princess Amelie, whom he loves with a passionate but carefully concealed affection. This fact I have considered it right to acquaint you with, the more especially as, after having received and entertained my son as affectionately as though he had been your own, you added to your kindness by inviting him to return, as quickly as his duties would allow, to enjoy that sweet companionship so precious to his heart; and it is probable that my apprising you of this circumstance may induce you to withdraw your intended hospitality to one who has presumed to aspire to the affections of your peerless child. I am perfectly well aware that the daughter of whom you are so justly proud might aspire to the first alliance in Europe, but I also know that so tender and devoted a parent as yourself would not hesitate to bestow the hand of the Princess Amelie on my son, if you believed by doing so her happiness would be secured. It is not for me to dwell upon Henry's merits; you have been graciously pleased to bestow your approval on his conduct thus far, and I venture to hope he will never give you cause to change the favourable opinion you have deigned to express concerning him. Of this be assured, that whatever may be your determination, we shall bow in respectful and implicit submission to it, and that I shall never be otherwise than your royal highness's most humble and obedient servant, Gustave Paul, Prince of Herkaüsen Oldenzaal. After the perusal of this letter, Rodolph remained for some time sad and pensive. Then, a gleam of hope darting across his mind, he returned to his daughter, whom Clémence was most tenderly consoling. "My dear child," said he, as he entered, "you yourself observed that this day seemed destined to be one of important discoveries and solemn explanations, but I did not then think your words would be so strikingly verified as they seem likely to be." "Dear father, what has happened?" "Fresh sources of uneasiness have arisen." "On whose account?" "On yours, my child. I fear you have only revealed to us a portion of your griefs." "Be kind enough to explain yourself," said Fleur de Marie, blushing. "Then hearken to me, my beloved child. You have, perhaps, good cause to fancy yourself unhappy. When, at the commencement of our conversation, you spoke of the hopes you still entertained, I understood your meaning, and my heart seemed broken by the blow with which I was menaced, for I read but too clearly that you desired to quit me for ever, and to bury yourself in the eternal seclusion of a cloister. My child, say, have I not divined your intentions?" "If you would consent," murmured forth Fleur de Marie, in a faint, gasping voice. "Would you then quit us?" exclaimed Clémence. "The abbey of St. Hermangeld is in the immediate neighbourhood of Gerolstein, and I should frequently see yourself and my father." "Remember, my child, that vows such as you would take are not to be recalled. You are scarcely 18 years of age, and one day you may, possibly—" "Oh, think not I should ever regret my choice. There is no rest or peace for me save in the solitude of a cloister. There I may be happy, if you and my second mother will but continue to me your affection."
"The duties and consolations of a religious life," said Rodolph, "might certainly, if not cure, at least alleviate the anguish of your lacerated and desponding mind, and although your resolution will cost me dear, I cannot but approve of it."
"Rodolph," cried the astonished Clémence, "do I hear aright? Is it possible you—"
"Allow me more fully to explain myself," replied Rodolph. Then addressing his daughter, he said, "But before an irrevocable decision is pronounced, it would be well to ascertain if nothing more suitable, both to your inclinations and our own, could be found for you than the life of a nun." Fleur de Marie and Clémence started at Rodolph's words and manner, while, fixing an earnest gaze on his daughter, the prince said abruptly, "What think you, my child, of your cousin, Prince Henry?" The brightest blush spread over the fair face of Fleur de Marie, who, after a momentary hesitation, threw herself weeping in her father's arms. "Then you love him, do you not, my darling child?" cried Rodolph, tenderly pressing her hands. "Fear not to confide the truth to your best friends."
"Alas!" replied Fleur de Marie, "you know not what it has cost me to conceal from you the state of my heart. Had you questioned me on the subject, I would gladly have told you all, but shame closed my lips, and would still have done so, but for your inquiry into the nature of my feelings."
"And have you any suspicion that Henry is aware of your love?"
"Gracious heavens, dearest father!" exclaimed Fleur de Marie, shrinking back in terror, "I trust not."
"Do you believe he returns your affection?"
"Oh, no, no! I trust he does not; he would suffer too deeply."
"And what gave rise to the love you entertained for your cousin?"
"Alas, I know not; it grew upon me almost unconsciously. Do you remember a portrait of a youth dressed as a page, in the apartments of the Abbess de Saint Hermangeld?"
"I know; it was the portrait of Henry."
"Believing the picture to be of distant date, I one day in your presence remarked upon the extreme beauty of the countenance, when you jestingly replied that it was the likeness of an ancestor, who in his youth had displayed an extraordinary share of sense, courage, and every estimable quality. This strengthened my first impression, and frequently after that day I used to delight in recalling to my mind the fine countenance and noble features of one I believed to have been long numbered with the dead. By degrees these reveries began to form one of my greatest pleasures, and many an hour have I passed gazing, amid smiles and tears, on one I fondly hoped I might be permitted to know and to love in another world. For in this," continued poor Fleur de Marie, with a most touching expression, "I well know I am unworthy to aspire to the love of any one but you, my kind, indulgent parents."
"I can now understand the nature of the reproof you once gave me for having misled you on the subject of the portrait."
"Conceive, dearest father, what was my confusion when I learnt from the superior that the portrait was a living subject, that of her nephew. My trouble was extreme, and earnestly did I endeavour to erase from my heart all the fond associations connected with that picture. In vain; the pertinacity with which I strove to forget but riveted the impression I had received; and unfortunately, dear father, you rendered the task of forgetting more difficult, by continually eulogising the heart, disposition, and principles of Prince Henry."
"You loved him, then, my child, from merely seeing his likeness and hearing his praises?"
"Without positively loving him, I felt myself attracted towards him by an irresistible impulse, for which I bitterly reproached myself. My only consolation was the thought that no person knew my fatal secret; for how could I presume to love? How excuse my ingratitude in not contenting myself with the tenderness bestowed on me by you, my father, and you also, dearest mother? In the midst of all these conflicting feelings I met my cousin, for the first time, at a ball given by you to the Archduchess Sophia. His resemblance to the portrait too well assured me it was he, and your introducing Prince Henry to me as a near relative afforded me ample opportunities of discovering that his manners were as captivating as his mind was cultivated."
"It is easy to conceive, then, that a mutual passion sprung up between you. Indeed, he won upon my regard ere I was aware of the ground he had gained. He spoke of you so admiringly, yet so respectfully."
"You had yourself praised him so highly."
"Not more than he deserved. It is impossible to possess a more noble nature, or a more generous and elevated character."
"I beseech you, dearest father, to spare me the fresh trial of hearing him thus praised by you? Alas! I am already wretched enough."
"Go on, my child. I have a reason in thus extolling your cousin. I will explain hereafter. Proceed."
"Though aware of the danger of thus daily associating with my cousin, I felt unable to withdraw myself from the pleasure his society afforded me; nor, spite of my implicit reliance on your indulgence, dear father, durst I disclose my fears to you. I could then only redouble my efforts to conceal my unfortunate attachment, and, shall I confess? There were moments when, forgetting the past, I gave myself up to all the dear delights of a friendship hitherto unknown to me. But the departure of Prince Henry from your court tore the veil from my eyes, and showed me how truly and ardently I loved him, though not with a sister's love, as I had made myself believe. I had resolved to open my heart entirely to you on this subject," continued Fleur de Marie, whose strength seemed utterly exhausted by her long confession, "and then to ask you what remained for one so every way unfortunate but to seek the repose of a cloister."
"Then, dearest daughter, let me answer the question ere you have put it, by saying there is a prospect as bright and smiling awaits your acceptance, as that you propose is cheerless and gloomy."
"What mean you?"
"Now then, listen to me. It was impossible for an affection as great as mine to be blinded to the mutual affection subsisting between yourself and your cousin. My penetration also quickly discovered that his passion for you amounted to idolatry, that he had but one hope, one desire on earth, that of being loved by you. At the time I played off that little joke respecting the portrait, I had not the least expectation of Henry's visiting Gerolstein. When, however, he did come, I saw no reason for changing the manner in which I had always treated him, and I therefore invited him to visit us on the same terms of friendly relationship he had hitherto done. A very little time had elapsed ere Clémence and myself saw plainly enough the cause of his frequent visits, or the mutual delight you felt in each other's society. Then mine became a difficult task. On the one hand, I rejoiced as a father that one so every way worthy of you should have won your affection. Then, on the other hand, my poor dear child, your past misfortunes forbade me to encourage the idea of uniting you to your cousin, to whom I several times spoke in a manner very different to the tone I should have adopted, had I contemplated bestowing on him your hand. Thus placed in a position so delicate, I endeavoured to preserve a strict neutrality, discouraging Prince Henry's attentions by every means in my power, and yet manifesting towards himself the same paternal kindness with which I had always treated him. And besides, my poor girl, after a life of so much unhappiness as yours, I could not bring myself suddenly to tear away the innocent pleasure you appeared to feel in the company of your cousin. It was something to see you even temporarily happy and cheerful, and even now your acquaintance with Prince Henry may be the means of securing your future tranquillity."
"Dear father, I understand you not."
"Prince Paul, Henry's father, has just sent me this letter. While considering such an alliance as an honour too great to aspire to, he solicits your hand for his son, who, he states, is inspired with a passion for you."
"Dearest father," cried Fleur de Marie, concealing her face with her hands, "do you forget?"
"I forget nothing, not even that to-morrow you enter a convent, where, besides being for ever lost to me, you will pass the remainder of your days in tears and austerity. If I must part with you, let it be to give you to a husband who will love you almost as tenderly as your father."
"Married? And to him, father? You cannot mean it."
"Indeed I do, but on one condition, that directly after your marriage has been celebrated here, without pomp or parade, you shall depart with your husband for some tranquil retreat in Italy or Switzerland, where you may live unknown and merely pass for opulent persons of middle rank. And my reason for attaching this proviso to my consent is because I feel assured that in the bosom of simple and unostentatious happiness you would by degrees forget the hateful past which is now only more painfully contrasted with the pomp and ceremony by which you are surrounded."
"Rodolph is right," said Clémence. "With Henry for your companion, and happy in each other's affection, past sorrows will soon be forgotten."
"And as I could not wholly part with you, Clémence and I would pay you a visit each year. Then, when time shall have healed your wounded spirit, my poor child, and present felicity shall have effaced all recollections of the past,
You will return to dwell among us, never more to part." "Forget in the past in present happiness?" murmured Fleur de Marie. "Even so, my child," replied Rodolph, scarcely able to restrain his emotion at seeing his daughter's scruples thus shaken. "Can it be possible," cried Fleur de Marie, "that such unspeakable felicity is reserved for me, the wife of Henry? And one day to pass my life between him, yourself, and my second mother," continued she, more subdued by the ineffable delight such a picture created in her mind. "All that happiness shall be yours, my precious child!" exclaimed Rodolph, fondly embracing Fleur de Marie. "I will reply at once to Henry's father that I consent to the marriage. Comfort yourself with the certainty that our separation will be but short. The fresh duties you will take upon yourself in a wedded life will serve to drive away all past retrospections and painful reminiscences; and should you yourself be a mother, you will know and feel how readily a parent sacrifices her own regrets and griefs to promote happiness of her child." "A mother! I a mother!" exclaimed Fleur de Marie with bitter despair, awakening at that word from the sweet illusion in which her memory seemed temporarily lulled. "Oh, no! I am unworthy to bear that sacred name. I should expire of shame in the presence of my own child, if, indeed, I could survive the horrible disclosures I must necessarily make to its father of my past life. Oh, never, never!" "My child, for pity's sake, listen to me." Pale and beautiful amidst her deep distress, Fleur de Marie arose with all the majesty of incurable sorrow, and, looking earnestly at Rodolph, she said, "We forget that, ere Prince Henry made me his wife, he should be acquainted with the past." "No, no, my daughter," replied Rodolph. "I had by no means forgotten what he both ought to know and shall learn of the melancholy tale." "Think you not that I should die, were I thus degraded in his eyes?" "And he will also admit and feel," added Clémence, "that if I style you my daughter, he may, without fear or shame, safely call you his wife." "Nay, dearest mother, I love Prince Henry too truly to bestow on him a hand that has been polluted by the touch of the ruffians of the Cité." A short time after this painful scene the following announcement appeared in the official gazette of Gerolstein: "The taking of the veil by the most high and mighty Princess Amelie of Gerolstein took place yesterday in the Abbey of St. Hermangeld, in the presence of the reigning Grand Duke and all his court. The vows of the novice were received by the Right Reverend and Illustrious Lord Charles Maximus, Archbishop of Oppenheim, Monseigneur Annibal André, one of the Princes of Delphis and Bishop of Ceuta, in partibus infidelium and apostolic nuncio, bestowed the salutation and papal benediction. The sermon was preached by the most reverend Seigneur Pierre d'Asfeld, canon of the chapter of Cologne, and Count of the Holy Roman Empire. Veni Creator Optime. End of Epilogue Chapter 2. Read by Céline Major. Epilogue Chapter 3 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Vows. Rodolph to Clémence. Gerolstein, 12th January, 1842. Your assurance that your father is better induces me to hope you will be enabled to return here with him shortly. I dreaded that at Rosenfeld, situated in the midst of the woods, he would be exposed to the piercing cold of our rigorous winters, but, unfortunately, his fondness for hunting rendered all our advice useless. I entreat you, Clémence, as soon as your father can bear the motion of the carriage, quit that country and this habitation, only fit for those Germans of an iron frame whose race has now disappeared. The ceremony of our poor child's taking the vows is fixed for to-morrow, the 13th of January, the fatal day on which I drew my sword on my father. Alas, I thought too soon I was forgiven. The hope of passing my life with you and my child made me forget that it was she who had been punished up to the present time, and that my punishment was to come. And it is come, when 6 months ago she disclosed the double torture she suffered, her incurable shame for the past, and her hopeless passion for Henry. These two sentiments became, by a fatal logic, the cause of her fixed resolve to take the veil. You know that we could not conceal from her that, had we been in her place, we should have pursued the same noble and courageous course she has adopted. How could we answer those humble words? I love Prince Henry too much to give him a hand that has been touched by the bandits of the Cité. I have seen her this morning, and though she seemed less pale than usual, though she said she did not suffer, yet her health gives me the most mortal alarm. Alas! This morning, when I saw beneath the veil those noble features, I could not refrain from thinking how beautiful she looked the day of our marriage. It seemed that our happiness was reflected on her face. As I told you, I saw her this morning. She does not know that tomorrow the Princess Juliana resigns her abbatical dignity, and that she has been unanimously chosen to succeed her. Since the beginning of her novitiate there has been but one opinion of her piety, her charity, and the exactitude with which she fulfills all the rules of the order. She even exaggerates their austerity. She exercises in the convent that authority she exercised everywhere, but of which she herself is ignorant. She confessed to me this morning that she is not so absorbed by her religious duties as to forget the past. I accuse myself, dear father, said she, because I cannot help reflecting that, had Heaven pleased to spare me the degradation that has stained my life, I might have lived happily with you and my husband. Spite of myself, I reflect on this and on what passed in the Cité. In vain I beseech Heaven to deliver me from these temptations, to fill my heart with himself, but he does not hear my prayers, doubtless because my life has rendered me unworthy of communion with him. But, cried I, clinging to this faint glimmer of hope, it is not yet too late. Your novitiate is only over to-day. You are yet free. Renounce this austere life. Dwell again with us, and our tenderness shall soften your grief. Shaking her head sorrowfully, she replied, The cloister is, indeed, solitary for me, accustomed as I have been to your tender care. Doubtless cruel recollections come over me, but I am consoled by the knowledge that I am performing my duty. I know that everywhere else I should be liable to be placed in that position in which I have already suffered so much. Your daughter shall do what she ought to do, suffer what she ought to suffer. Without founding any great hopes on this interview, I yet said to myself, she can renounce the cloister. But as she is determined, I can but repeat her words. God alone can offer me a refuge worthy of himself. Adieu, dear Clémence. It consoles me to see you grieve with me, for I can say our child without egotism in my sufferings. Often this thought lightens my sorrow, for you are left to me, and what is left to Fleur de Marie. Adieu again. Return soon. R. Abbé of St. Hermangeld, 4:00 in the morning. Reassure yourself, Clémence. Thank God, the danger is over, but the crisis was terrible. Last evening, agitated by my thoughts, I recollected the paleness and languor of my poor child, and that she was obliged to pass almost all the night in the church in prayer. I sent Murphy and David to demand the Princess Juliana's permission to remain until the morrow in the mansion that Henry occupied usually. Thus my child would have prompt assistance, and I prompt intelligence, in case that her strength failed under this rigorous, I will not say cruel, obligation to pass the whole of a cold winter's night in the church. I wrote to Fleur de Marie that, whilst I respected her religious exercises, I besought her to watch in her cell and not in the church. This was her reply. My dear father, I thank you for this fresh proof of your tenderness, but be not alarmed, I am sufficiently strong to perform my duty. Your daughter must be guilty of no weakness. The rule orders it, I must submit. Should it cause me some physical sufferings, how joyfully shall I offer them to God! Adieu, dear father. I cannot say I pray for you, because whenever I pray to heaven I cannot help remembering you in my prayers. You have been to me on earth what God will be, if I merit it, in heaven. Bless your child, who will be tomorrow the spouse of heaven. Sister Amélie. This letter in some measure reassured me, however I had also a vigil to keep. At nightfall I went to a pavilion I had built, near my father's monument, in expiation of this fatal night. About 1:00 I heard Murphy's voice. He came from the convent in order to inform me that, as I had feared, my unhappy child, spite of her resolution, had not had sufficient strength to accomplish this barbarous custom. At 8:00 in the evening Fleur de Marie knelt and prayed until midnight, but, overpowered by her emotion and the intense cold, she fainted. 2 nuns instantly raised her and bore her to her cell. David was instantly summoned, and Murphy came to me. I hastened to the convent, where the abbess assured me that my daughter's swoon, from which she had recovered, had been caused only by her weakness, but that David feared that my presence might seriously affect her. I feared they were preparing me for something more dreadful, but the superior said, "I assure you, monseigneur, the princess is in no danger. The restorative the doctor has given her has greatly recruited her strength." David soon returned. She was better, but had insisted upon continuing her vigil, consenting only to kneel upon a cushion. "She is in the church, then?" cried I. "Yes, monseigneur, but she will quit it in a quarter of an hour." I entered the church, and, by the faint light of a lamp, I saw her kneeling and praying fervently. 3:00 struck. 2 sisters, seated in the stalls, advanced and spoke to her. She crossed herself, rose, and traversed the choir with a firm step, and yet as she passed the lamp she seemed to me deathly pale. I remain at the abbey until the ceremony be over. I think now it is useless to send this letter incomplete. I will forward it tomorrow, with all the details of this sad day. Adieu, dearest. I am heart-broken. Pity. R. End of Epilogue, Chapter 3. Read by Céline Major. The last chapter of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The last chapter, the 13th of January. Rodolphe to Clémence. The 13th of January. Now a doubly sinister anniversary. Dearest, we have lost her for ever. All is over, ended all. It is true, then, there is a horrid pleasure in relating a terrible grief. Yesterday I was complaining of the necessity that kept you from me. To-day, Clémence, I congratulate myself that you are not here. You would have suffered too much. This morning I was in a light slumber, and was awakened by the sound of bells. I started in a fright. It seemed to me a funereal sound. A knell. In fact, our daughter is dead, dead to us. And from to-day, Clémence, you must begin to wear her mourning in your heart, a heart always so maternally disposed towards her. Whether our child be buried beneath the marble of a tomb or the vault of the cloister, what is the difference to us? Hardly 18 years of age, yet dead to the world. At noon the profession took place, with solemn pomp, and I was present, concealed behind the curtains of our pew. I felt, but even with greater intensity, all the poignant emotion we underwent at her novitiate. How strange! She is adored, and they believe universally that she was attracted to a religious life by an irresistible vocation, and yet, whilst they believe it was a happy event for her, an overwhelming sadness weighed down the spectators. There appeared in the very air, as it were, a doleful foreboding, and it was founded, if only half realized. The profession terminated, they led our child into the chapter room, where the nomination of the new abbess was to take place, and, thanks to my sovereign privilege, I went into this room to await Fleur de Marie's return to the choir. She soon entered. Her emotion and weakness were so excessive that 2 of the sisters supported her. I was alarmed less at her paleness and the great change in her features, than at the peculiar expression of her smile, which seemed to me imprinted with a kind of secret satisfaction. Clémence, I say to you, perhaps we may very soon require all our courage. I feel within myself that our child is mortally smitten. May Heaven grant that I am deceived, and may my presentiments arise only from the despairing sadness which this melancholy spectacle has inspired. Fleur de Marie entered the chapter room, all the stalls were filled by the nuns. She went modestly to place herself last on the left-hand side, still leaning on the arm of one of the sisters, for she yet appeared very weak. The Princess Juliana was seated at the end of the apartment, with the Grand Prioress on one side and another dignitary on the other, holding in her hand the golden crozier, the symbol of abbatial authority. There was profound silence, and then the lady abbess arose, took the crozier in her hand, and said in a voice of great emotion, "My dear daughters, my great age compels me to confide to younger hands this emblem of my spiritual power," and she pointed to the crozier. I am authorized by a bull of our Holy Father. I will therefore present to the benediction of Monseigneur the Archbishop of Oppenheim, and to the approbation of His Royal Highness the Grand Duke our Sovereign, whosoever of my dear daughters shall be pointed out by you to succeed me. Our Grand Prioress will inform you of the result of the election, and she who has been chosen will receive my crosier and ring." I did not take my eyes off my daughter. Standing up in her stall, her 2 hands folded over her bosom, her eyes cast down, and half covered by her white veil and the long folds of her black gown, she was pensive and motionless, not supposing for a moment that she would herself be elected, as this fact had been communicated by the abbess to no one but myself. The Grand Prioress took a book and read, "Each of our dear sisters having been, according to the rule, requested a week since to place her vote in the hands of our Holy Mother, and keep her choice secret until this moment, in the name of our Holy Mother I declare to you, my dear, dear sisters, that one of you has, by her exemplary piety, merited the unanimous suffrages of the community, and that she is our sister Amélie, the most noble and puissant Princess of Gerolstein." At these words a murmur of pleased surprise and satisfaction went around the apartment. The eyes of all the nuns were fixed on my daughter with an expression of tender sympathy, and in spite of my painful forebodings, I was myself deeply touched at this nomination, which, done isolatedly and secretly, had yet presented such an affecting unanimity. The abbess continued in a serious and loud voice, "My dear daughters, if it be, indeed, Sister Amélie whom you think the most worthy and most deserving of you all, if it be she whom you recognize as your spiritual superior, let each of you reply to me in turn, my dear daughters." And each nun replied in a clear voice, "Freely and voluntarily I have chosen, and I do choose, Sister Amélie for my Holy Mother and Superior." Overcome by inexpressible emotion, my poor child fell on her knees, clasped her hands, and remained so until each vote was declared. Then the abbess, placing the crosier and the ring in the hands of the Grand Prioress, advanced towards my daughter to take her hand and conduct her to the abbatial seat. "Rise, my dear daughter," said the abbess. "Come and assume the place that belongs to you. Your virtues, and not your rank, have obtained for you the position you have gained." "Pardon, my Holy Mother, but I would speak to my sisters." "Then first place yourself, my dear child, in your abbatial seat," said the princess. "It is from thence your voice shall be heard." "That place, Holy Mother, never can be mine," replied Fleur de Marie, in a low and tremulous voice. "What mean you, my dear daughter?" "So high a dignity was not made for me, Holy Mother." "But the wishes of all your sisters call you to it." "Permit me, Holy Mother, to make here, on my knees, a solemn confession, and my sisters will see, and you also, Holy Mother, that the humblest condition is not humble enough for me." "This arises from your modesty, my dear child," said the superior with kindness, believing that the unhappy girl was giving way to a feeling of over delicacy. But I divined the confession Fleur de Marie was about to make, and greatly alarmed, I exclaimed, in a voice of entreaty, "My child, I conjure thee." It is impossible, my dearest Clémence, to describe the look which Fleur de Marie gave me. In an instant she understood all, and saw how deeply I should share in the shame of this horrible revelation. She comprehended that after such a confession they might accuse me of falsehood, for I had always made it out that Fleur de Marie had never left her mother. At this reflection the poor dear child thought she would be guilty of the blackest ingratitude towards me. She had not power to continue, but bowed down her head, overcome, overwhelmed. "Again I assure you, my dear child," said the abbess, "your modesty deceives you. The unanimity of the choice of your sisters proves how worthy you are to replace me. It is not the princess, it is Sister Amélie who is elected. For us your life began on the day when you first put foot in this house of the Lord, and it is this exemplary and holy life that we recompense. I will say more, my dear daughter. If before you entered this retreat your life had been as wrong as it has been, on the contrary, pure and praiseworthy, the heavenly virtues of which you have given me an example since your abode here would expiate and ransom, in the eyes of the Lord, any past life, however culpable. And now, my dear daughter, judge if your modesty ought not to be reassured." These words of the abbess were, as you may think, my Clémence, the more precious for Fleur de Marie, as she believed the past ineffaceable. Unfortunately, this scene had deeply moved her, and although she affected calmness and serenity, I saw that her features altered in a most distressing manner. "I believe I have convinced you, my dear daughter," said the Princess Juliana, "and you will not cause so great a grief to your sisters as to refuse this mark of their confidence and affection." "No, Holy Mother," she said, with an expression which struck me, and in a voice more and more feeble. "I think now I may accept; but as I feel myself fatigued and in pain, if you will permit it, Holy Mother, the ceremony of the consecration shall not take place for a few days." "As you wish, my dear daughter. But in the meanwhile, until your dignity is blessed and consecrated, take this ring, come to your place, and our dear sisters will do you homage according to our rules." And the superior, putting the pastoral ring on Fleur de Marie's finger, led her to the abbatial seat. It was a simple and touching sight. Supported on one side by the grand prioress, bearing the golden crozier, and on the other by the Princess Juliana, each of the sisters, as she passed by, made obeisance to our child, and respectfully kissed her hand. But judge of my affright when she swooned before the procession of the sisters was terminated. David had not quitted the convent, and he hastened to the abbess's apartment, whither we had conveyed her, and then attended to her. The superior having returned to close the sitting of the chapter, I remained alone with my daughter. After looking at me for some time, she said, "My dear father, can you forget my ingratitude? Can you forget that at the moment when I was about to make my painful confession, when you implored me—" "Silence, I beseech you." "And I did not reflect," she continued with bitterness, "that in telling in the face of all the world from what an abyss of depravity you had rescued me, I revealed a secret which you had preserved out of tenderness to me. It would have been to accuse you publicly, you, my father, of a dissimulation, which you only resigned yourself to assure me a brilliant and honoured existence. Can you ever forgive me?" Instead of replying, I pressed my lips on her forehead. She felt my tears flow. Having kissed my hands many times, she said, "Now I feel better, and as I now am dead to the world, I should like to make a few bequests in favour of several persons, but as all I have comes from you, do you authorize me, dearest father?" "Say, dearest, and I will do all you desire." "I should wish my beloved mother to keep always in the little boudoir in which she usually sits, my embroidery frame, with the work I began." "It shall be so, love. Your apartment is as when you left it. Clémence will be deeply touched by your thought of her." "As for you, dear father, take, I pray, my large ebony armchair, in which I have thought of, reflected upon so much." "I will put it beside my own, in my own private closet, and will imagine I see you in it every day, where you have so often sat," I said, unable to repress my tears. "And now I would leave some souvenirs to those who took so much interest in me when I was unhappy. To Madame Georges I would give the writing desk I have lately used. She taught me to write originally, so the gift will be very appropriate," she said, with her sweet smile. "As to the venerable curé of Bouqueval, who instructed me in the religion, I intend for him the beautiful crucifix in my oratory." "Very well, my dearest child." "I should like to send my bandeau of pearls to my good little Rigolette. It is a simple ornament which she may wear in her beautiful black hair. And as you know where Martial and La Louve are in Algeria, I should like to send to the brave woman who saved my life, my gold enamelled cross. These different keepsakes, dearest father, I would have sent to them from Fleur de Marie." "I will do all you wish. I will not forget one." "I am sure you will not, dearest father." "Is there no other person present to your memory?" The dear child understood me, and pressed my hand, whilst a slight blush tinged her pale cheeks as I said, "He is better, out of danger. And his father?" "Better as his son is better. And what will you give to Henry? A souvenir from you will be a consolation so dear and precious." "My father, offer him my prie-dieu. Alas! I have often watered it with my tears when begging from heaven for strength to forget Henry, as I was unworthy of his love."
"How happy it will make him to see that you have had one thought of him!"
"As to the asylum for the orphans and young girls abandoned by their parents, I should wish, my dear father, that—"
Here Rodolph's letter was broken off by these words, almost illegible: "Clémence, Murphy will conclude this letter. I am lost, bereft of sense. Ah, the 13th of January." At the end of this letter Murphy had written as follows: "Madame, by the order of his Royal Highness I complete this sorrowful recital. The 2 letters of Monseigneur will have prepared your Royal Highness for the overwhelming news I have to communicate. 3 hours since, whilst Monseigneur was writing to your Royal Highness, I was waiting in the antechamber for a letter to be dispatched by a courier, when suddenly I saw the Princess Juliana enter in the greatest consternation. 'Where is his Royal Highness?' she said to me in an agitated voice. 'Writing to the Grand Duchess,' I replied. 'Sir Walter,' she said, 'you must inform Monseigneur of a terrible event. You are his friend, you should tell him. From you the blow may be less terrible.' I understood all, and thought it most prudent to charge myself with the distressing intelligence. The superior having added that the Princess Amelie was sinking gradually, and that Monseigneur must hasten to receive his daughter's last sigh, I went into the duke's room, who saw how pale I was. 'You have some bad news for me.' 'Terrible, monseigneur! But courage, courage!' 'Ah, my forebodings!' he exclaimed, and without adding a word he ran to the cloisters. I followed him. From the apartment of the superior the Princess Amelie had been conveyed to her cell after her last interview with Monseigneur. One of the sisters watched over her, and at the end of an hour she perceived that the Princess Amelie's voice, who spoke to her at intervals, was weaker, and more oppressed. The sister hastened to inform the superior, who sent for Dr. David, who administered a cordial. But it was useless, the pulse was scarcely perceptible. He saw with despair that the reiterated emotions having probably exhausted the little strength of the Princess Amelie, there was not a hope of saving her left. Monseigneur arrived at this moment. The Princess Amelie had just received the last sacrament. A slight degree of consciousness remained. In one hand, crossed over her chest, she held the remains of her little rose tree. Monseigneur fell on his knees at the foot of the bed and sobbed, 'My child, my beloved child,' in a voice of piercing agony. The Princess Amelie heard him, turned her head a little towards him, opened her eyes, tried to smile, and said in a faint voice, 'My dearest father, pardon! Henry, too, and my beloved mother, pardon!' These were her last words. After a slight struggle of 1 hour, she rendered her soul to God. When his daughter had breathed her last sigh Monseigneur did not say a word. His calmness and silence were frightful. He closed the eyelids of the princess, kissed her forehead several times, took piously from her hands the relics of the little rose tree, and left the cell. I followed him, and he returned to the house outside the cloister when, showing me the letter he had commenced writing to your royal highness, and to which he in vain endeavoured to add a few words, for his hand trembled too convulsively, he said to me, 'I cannot write, I am crushed. My senses are gone. Write to the Grand Duchess that I have no longer a daughter.' I have executed the orders of Monseigneur. May I be allowed, as his old servant, to entreat your royal highness to hasten your return as soon as the health of M. d'Orbigny will permit? Nothing but the presence of your royal highness can calm Monseigneur's despair. He will watch his daughter's remains every night until the day when she is to be buried in the grand ducal chapel. I have accomplished my sad task, madame. Deign to excuse the incoherence of this letter, and to receive the expression of respectful devotion which I have the honour to be, your royal highness's most obedient servant, Walter Murphy. On the evening before the funeral of the Princess Amelie,
Clémence arrived at Gerolstein with her father. Rodolph was not alone on the day of Fleur de Marie's interment. End of the Epilogue. End of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. Recorded by Céline Major.